Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Elliot had always been drawn to books. There was something soothing about the smell of old paper, the way the spines cracked open for the first time, the sound of pages turning in the silence of a library. He had spent most of his life buried in novels, academic papers, and history texts, feeling more at home among the shelves than anywhere else. That's probably why, when he stumbled upon the job opening for the night assistant position at the town's library, it seemed like a perfect fit. The library wasn't a grand, city center building with sweeping marble staircases and bustling crowds. It was old, really old, and nestled on the edge of town, overshadowed by thick, overgrown trees and the distant hum of the highway. Its stone facade, once gray and dignified, had faded into a dull, melancholic shade. The windows were tall, but often clouded with grime, and the front doors creaked like they had secrets to tell. But for Elliot, there was something comforting in its age, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up in the best possible way. It was the sort of place where time seemed to slow down. The library's hours were long, open from dawn until midnight, but it was the late shifts that intrigued Elliot the most. He was given the responsibility of closing up the library each night, a job that meant wandering the stacks alone after hours, tidying up, and occasionally helping the few night owls who still wandered in. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet, and more importantly, it was just what he needed. On his first night in charge, Elliot arrived early to familiarize himself with the layout of the library. The main floor was filled with rows of bookshelves, each organized by genre and subject, though not in a way that was immediately logical. The nonfiction section was juxtaposed with the mystery novels, and the children's books were tucked away in the back near an old fireplace that hadn't been used in years. Ms. Langley, he called, looking around for the head librarian. She was nowhere to be seen. The library was silent, too silent for a place that should have been filled with the rustling of books and the murmurs of readers. Suddenly, he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and turned to CMS. Langley stepping out from behind a shelf, her thin frame casting a long shadow. She had an almost ethereal quality about her, with stark white hair pulled back into a tight bun, glasses perched precariously at the end of her nose, and an expression that was difficult to read. "Ah, Elliot, you've arrived." "Good." She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'll show you the ropes, but I trust you can manage the rest." "Of course," Elliot said, though he couldn't shake the feeling that she was sizing him up. She led him through the library, pointing out where everything was and giving brief instructions on how to handle late patrons and overdue books. She seemed distracted, always looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone or something to be watching. "Just make sure you avoid the restricted section," she warned, her voice dropping lower. "Some of those books, they're not for casual readers." Elliot nodded, but the curiosity inside him began to stir. Restricted section? He hadn't seen anything labeled as such. "And be careful of the basement. MS." Langley added, her tone taking on a more serious edge. "It's not often used, but if you need to go down there for something, be quick. Don't linger." Elliot wasn't sure what to make of her cryptic warnings, but he didn't question them. After all, this was just a job, right? Nothing more. That night, as the clock struck midnight and the last few patrons filed out of the library, Elliot found himself alone. The air seemed thicker now, colder. He quickly worked to finish his duties, rearranging a few misplaced books and wiping down the counter. But as the minutes stretched on, he began to feel the weight of the silence. It wasn't like the peaceful quiet of an ordinary library. There was something else in the air, something he couldn't explain. The longer he stood there, the more it felt like the library was holding its breath. He turned toward the back of the building, where the staircase led to the second floor and, further still, to the basement. He'd avoided the stairs earlier in the day, but now his curiosity gnawed at him. Without thinking, he made his way toward the basement door, the thick, wooden frame heavy under his touch. The dim lights flickered overhead as he descended the steps, the air growing colder with each footstep. At the bottom, the basement was far larger than he had expected. The rows of bookshelves here seemed ancient, covered in dust, as if they hadn't been touched in years. The air smelled musty, and Elliot felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, though no one was there. He lingered for a moment, unsure of why he was drawn to this part of the library. The shelves here were crammed with more books than he could count, each one older and more worn than the last. But it was one particular shelf, hidden behind an old wooden pillar, that caught his eye. There, partially obscured by shadows, was a small door. It was half hidden, like it had been forgotten. Elliot's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know why, but he felt an irresistible pull toward it. His hand reached out, trembling slightly, as he pushed the door open, revealing a narrow passageway beyond. At midnight, you will feel the darkness creeping. A shadow will fall over what you hold dear. To resist, it is to break the cycle, but not without cost. Elliot blinked, staring at the sentence, trying to comprehend what he had just read. He flipped the page, his pulse quickening. To save the ones you love, you must first release them from the grip of fate. But those who stray from this path are not free. They are forever bound to the library, as are those who seek the knowledge of what lies ahead. He slammed the book shut, his breath catching in his throat. The library suddenly felt smaller, darker, like the walls were closing in on him. What was this? He set the book back on the shelf quickly, his hand trembling. He backed away, only to stumble over a loose floorboard. His flashlight rolled away from him, its beam cutting across the room in random directions. He crouched down, heart pounding, and grabbed the light. As he turned to stand, he caught a glimpse of something in the far corner of the room, a shadow, a movement, but nothing was there when he looked directly. The whispers started then, low, murmuring voices, as if 1,000 conversations were happening all at once, just beyond the reach of his understanding. He couldn't make out the words, but they felt wrong. A faint tapping echoed against the stone floor. The sound was soft at first, but it grew louder, more urgent. It was coming from the far end of the room, near the rows of those strange books. Elliot's pulse raced, and for the first time in his life, he truly felt afraid of a place that had once felt like home. He stood, frozen in place, staring down the passage. "Hello," he called, his voice sounding weak even to himself. There was no answer, only the persistent tapping, now accompanied by a low, eerie hum. The light flickered again, and Elliot felt something shift behind him, a pressure building in the air. The library was alive in a way he had never experienced before, as if the books themselves were watching him, waiting for something. He turned and ran. He wasn't sure where he was going at first, just desperate to escape whatever was making him feel like this, like he was no longer in control of his own thoughts. He ran back up the stairs, past the shelves, the strange books, and into the main floor of the library. His breath came in quick, shallow bursts as he tried to calm himself. The front door was in sight. All he had to do was get out, leave, and he could forget everything that had just happened. But as his eyes landed on the exit, he froze. His door was locked. The brass handle, once so familiar and comforting, now felt foreign and cold in his hand. "Ms. Langley," he called, his voice now panicked. "Ms. Langley, help." But there was no response. The library had grown eerily still again, the hum gone, the tapping silenced. It was as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting, and then, just as he was about to turn and search for MS. Langley, he heard it, a soft, deliberate creak from behind him, as though something heavy was shifting on the floor. Slowly, he turned. In the far corner of the room, near the stacks, something moved. A figure, hunched and dark, its form barely visible in the shadows. It didn't speak. It didn't move, except for a slow, unnatural sway. But the weight of its presence pressed down on him, like a suffocating fog. Elliot took a step back, his mind reeling. What had he gotten himself into? The thing moved again, this time slowly, deliberately, taking one step toward him. And with that movement, the whispers returned, louder now, swirling around him in a language that seemed to claw at his very soul. Leave, before it's too late. Elliot's feet felt glued to the floor as he stared at the figure in the corner, unable to tear his eyes away. The room seemed to darken around it, the shadows growing thicker, more oppressive. The figure, too tall, too still, swayed ever so slightly, as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist. For a long, suffocating moment, there was only the sound of Elliot's rapid breathing. His fingers gripped the flashlight so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heart hammered in his chest, but his legs refused to move. And then, in the silence, the figure spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It was a strange, guttural sound, like something that had been trapped in the dark for centuries, desperate to escape. The words it uttered weren't entirely clear, but they carried a weight that sent a chill running down his spine. You should not have come here. Elliot's stomach twisted. He took an unsteady step back, but the figure did not advance, at least not immediately. It only seemed to sway, and with every slight movement, the temperature in the room seemed to drop further. Elliot's eyes darted around the library. The doors were locked. The windows were sealed. There was no escape. The library remembers. The voice rasped, this time more forcefully, and the shadows around the figure seemed to pulse as if alive. The books, they remember. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. He was going to die here, wasn't he? Trapped in this place. The library was alive. The books were alive. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew, deep down, it was more than he could handle. He could feel the weight of his own fear gnawing at him. The whispering voices returned, louder now, swirling around him like an invisible storm. Get out! Get out! Leave before it's too late. With trembling hands, Elliot fumbled for his phone. Maybe he could call for help, but the moment he unlocked it, the screen flickered and went black. He whispered, panic flooding him as he tried to restart the phone. Nothing. It was dead. His mind raced. He couldn't stay here, not with whatever that thing was lurking in the shadows. He needed to find MS. Langley. She had to know what was going on. She had to help him. Just as he turned toward the staircase to the second floor, he heard a voice, a soft, barely audible whisper in his ear, as though someone was standing right beside him. It chilled him to the bone, and he froze, slowly turning his head. It wasn't Ms. Langley. It was the figure. It had moved. In the blink of an eye, it was standing just behind him, too close. The scent of decay and dust filled his nostrils, making him gag. You should have left when you had the chance, it rasped, its breath hot against his skin. Now you will stay. Forever. Elliot staggered backward, his body moving on instinct. His heart raced, and the air felt thick, as if the very walls of the library were closing in on him. The figure's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed faintly, like dying embers, and they fixed on him with terrifying intensity. The books must be read. It intoned, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. The library must consume. You are part of it now. Elliot spun on his heel and bolted toward the nearest exit, only to find it wasn't there anymore. The library had changed. The door he had run toward moments ago had vanished entirely, replaced by an endless row of bookshelves. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of it, but the layout was impossible to grasp. The library didn't make sense. It never had. He looked up and saw the second-floor balcony, a narrow walkway above him, leading to the manager's office. Ms. Langley had to be up there. She had to know how to stop this. Maybe she could help him escape. But before he could make a move toward the stairs, the soft voice called out to him again, louder this time. Stop running. Elliot turned, his chest heaving, and saw the figure again. This time, it was standing in front of him, blocking his path. The library is eternal. The figure's voice reverberated. sending ripples of fear through Elliot's entire body. You are part of it now. The knowledge is yours to keep. The stories must continue. No, Elliot whispered, shaking his head. No, please. I want to go home. The figure's form seemed to pulse, its shadow expanding like a living thing. The whispering voices rose in volume, almost deafening in their urgency. Elliot's knees gave way, and he collapsed to the floor, clutching his head as the voices rained down on him. And then, just as suddenly as the chaos had started, everything went silent. The shadows receded, the temperature returned to normal, and the air cleared. For a moment, Elliot thought maybe he had imagined it all, the whispers, the figure, the cold. But as he slowly lifted his head, he saw something that froze him in place. The books on the shelves were no longer just books. They were alive. Their pages fluttered as though a breeze had passed through them, but there was no wind. The books shifted as if trying to communicate with him. He could hear the soft rustling of the pages, almost like they were calling to him, urging him to read. One book near the back caught his eye. It was different from the others. Unlike the rest of the black-bound tomes, this one was gold embossed, its cover intricate and ornate, almost regal. Elliot felt drawn to it. He couldn't explain it, but he knew, deep down, that this book held the answers. It was the key. His trembling hand reached out. And the moment his fingers touched the cover, he heard a voice, this time, not in the air, but in his mind. Clear, sharp. You have made your choice. The library had him now. The moment Elliot's fingers brushed the cover of the gold-embossed book, everything around him seemed to stop. The air became thick with an unseen pressure, and the silence was so intense that it felt like the whole library was holding its breath. A shiver ran down his spine as the book seemed to pulse beneath his touch. The warm golden light that had been faintly emanating from it flared, blinding him for a second. When his vision returned, the shadows in the library had grown darker, deeper, swallowing up the light and pulling him into their depth. That voice spoke again, clearer this time, directly inside his mind. You have made your choice. The library claims you. Elliot's heart hammered in his chest. His hand was still on the book, but now it felt like it was pulling him in, as if the pages themselves were alive, drawing him into their depths. His fingers began to tremble uncontrollably, unable to pull away. W, what do you want from me? Elliot croaked, his voice trembling with fear. We want nothing from you. You are the one who has come to us. You are the one who opened the door. The whispering voices, now more distinct, swirled around him, as if they were laughing, mocking him. It was impossible to tell where the voices came from, but they surrounded him completely, the cacophony growing louder, more insistent. In the corner of his eye, he could see the shadowy figure, the one that had been watching him, slowly advancing, its form becoming more defined with each step. The creature's eyes glowed with a dull fire, watching Elliot with a gaze that pierced him to his core. You will serve now, just like the others. You will become part of the library's eternal story. You will be one of the keepers. Elliot shook his head, his chest tight with panic. No, I don't want this. I didn't mean to. But before he could finish, the book he was holding sprang open, its pages fluttering wildly as if they were caught in a gale. The words on the pages twisted and writhed, almost like they were alive, forming shapes and symbols Elliot couldn't understand. But the sensation of the pages brushing against his fingers felt wrong. Cold, clammy, as if they were soaked in something far darker than ink. The light from the book blazed bright again, this time so intense it burned his retinas. He couldn't look away, couldn't move his hand. His body felt paralyzed, trapped in some invisible grip that made it impossible to breathe. Suddenly, the voices stopped. The air stilled, and the library seemed to grow impossibly silent, as if waiting for something. Then, a deep rumble reverberated from the walls, low and guttural, as though the entire building was waking up. The figure, now standing directly in front of him, spoke again, its voice no longer a whisper, but a deep, resonating command. "You will read." The book in his hands shook violently. Elliot's heart skipped a beat as he felt the words on the pages move under his fingers, shifting, pulling him deeper into its grip. The voice, now full of an ancient authority, rang out again. The library must be fed. The knowledge must be preserved. All those who seek its secrets must become part of its story. Elliot's mind spun. What did it mean? What was happening to him? Suddenly, he saw it. An image, clear as day, flashed before his eyes. The library's secret. A vast, sprawling maze of endless bookshelves stretching on forever, filled with millions of stories, each one written in a language not meant for mortal eyes. Each one containing a soul, a life, a memory of someone who had once walked this earth, but whose presence had been swallowed by the library. They were all here now, trapped within the pages. Every single person who had ever set foot in a library with the intention of reading the forbidden had become part of its eternal archive. And now, Elliot was no different. "You must choose," the voice echoed again. "Either you embrace your fate as a keeper of a library, or you will become one of the books locked away forever." Elliot's mind raced. There had to be another way. There had to be an escape. But the longer he stood there, the more he could feel the pull of the book, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. His hand, shaking uncontrollably, hovered over the pages as if drawn to them, and he could feel the stories, the lives, of those who had come before him calling out, urging him to read. If he read, would he truly understand? Would he find the answer he needed? Or would he, too, be bound forever to the library, to the endless cycle of stories that could never be completed? His eyes darted to the figure standing before him, its glowing eyes watching him like a predator observing its prey. "Choose." The voice of the figure rang out again, its words like thunder in the silence. Without thinking, Elliot threw the book across the room. "No," he shouted, his voice hoarse with fear and defiance. "I won't be part of this." For a moment, nothing happened. The library was still. The figure didn't move. But then, the book shifted on its own, its pages flipping rapidly as though it had a mind of its own. It floated back into the air and landed neatly in Elliot's hands again, as if mocking his resistance. The whispers started again, more intense this time, louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from the very walls of the library, from the books, from the air. They were all around him, suffocating him. "You cannot escape." The figure's voice was now low and final. "The library calls, and you have already answered." The darkness grew deeper. And then, with terrifying clarity, Elliot realized the truth. The library wasn't just a place, it was a living entity. A predator that fed on knowledge, on the souls of those who sought it. And now, he was its latest prey. But as he stood there, trapped in its grip, a thought flickered in the back of his mind. Maybe, just maybe, there was one last chance to escape, and he would have to be willing to face the cost. Elliot's mind raced. The figure's words rang in his ears, but there was a flicker of something, hope, perhaps, or desperation, rising within him. He couldn't give in. He refused to be another lost soul trapped in the library forever. But the walls seemed to press in around him, the shadows stretching ever longer as the figure continued to sway, its hollow eyes burning into him. "You cannot fight what is inevitable," the figure rasped, its voice like sandpaper scraping across stone. "The library has you. You are part of its collection now, like all those before you." "No," Elliot whispered, his voice trembling but firm. He took a shaky step back, trying to find some escape, any way out. But the room seemed to grow smaller with each step. His pulse thundered in his ears. The air felt heavier, suffocating. He glanced around desperately, eyes landing on the nearest bookshelf. His heart skipped a beat as he noticed something, a gap between the shelves, a space barely visible in the dim light, like a hidden door. The whispers seemed to grow louder, urging him to stop, to surrender. But the flickering thought of escape was stronger now. Elliot bolted toward the gap. The figure snarled, its form shifting and twisting, growing larger and more menacing as it gave chase. But Elliot didn't stop. He pushed past the rows of books, ignoring the voices that whispered lies in his ears. His fingers brushed against the cool, smooth surface of the shelves, and then, finally, he reached the hidden doorway. It was a thin crack, barely wide enough for him to slip through. Without hesitation, he squeezed into the narrow space, heart pounding. The figure's voice, now tinged with fury, echoed through the library, but it felt distant. The space behind the bookshelf was dark, so dark that even his flashlight flickered, barely managing to cast a pale beam into the void. But it was a doorway, a potential escape. And that was enough. He crawled forward, not daring to look back, the darkness swallowing him whole. The tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and turning as if it had no beginning or end. But he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. And then at the far end of the tunnel, he saw it. A faint light. His breath hitched as he scrambled toward it, moving faster now, the sound of his own frantic footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The whispers, the voices had fallen silent, but the weight of the library's presence still pressed down on him, suffocating. As he neared the light, a low hum began to vibrate through the walls. It was deep and rhythmic like a heartbeat, and just as he reached the end of the tunnel, he stepped into a wide, open space. Elliot gasped, his eyes widening in disbelief. Before him lay an ancient room, far older than the library itself. The walls were lined with books, yes, but there was something else here, something more ancient. In the center of the room stood a massive, ornate stone pedestal, its surface covered in strange runes that seemed to shimmer and shift as he looked at them. The air in the room was thick with the scent of dust and old paper, but there was also an unsettling, metallic tang, like something had been spilled here long ago. The pedestal was empty, save for a single, open book resting upon it. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The book was identical to the gold-embossed one that had nearly consumed him in the library. But this one looked ancient, as though it had been waiting for him. Suddenly, the hum grew louder, and the shadows began to move again, gathering in the corners of the room. The space felt alive, aware of his presence. A voice rang out in his mind, the same one that had spoken to him before, the same voice that had warned him to stop. "You have found the Keeper's chamber." Elliot froze. His stomach churned with dread. The Keeper's chamber? This is where it begins, where it all ends. The book on the pedestal called to him, its pages fluttering even though there was no wind. The whispers returned, louder than ever, but this time they weren't just from the books. They seemed to come from everywhere, the walls, the air, the floor beneath his feet. You can still walk away, but the price will be great. If you choose the book, you become its new keeper. Elliot's mind spun. The Keeper. It was all becoming clear now. This was no ordinary library. This place was a living, breathing entity, a trap for those who sought forbidden knowledge. And the Keeper was its master, the one who held dominion over all. But the question lingered. Could he resist? Could he escape without paying the price? His fingers twitched toward the book, as if it had a mind of its own, pulling him toward it. The runes on the pedestal glowed brighter with each step he took. The whispers were maddening now, urging him, coaxing him to read. And in that moment, Ellie understood what he had to do. The Keeper's choice was not just about taking the role of a librarian or succumbing to the library's hunger. It was about breaking the cycle, escaping the library's grip once and for all. But it came with a sacrifice. The Keeper was tied to the library, bound to it for eternity, but they had the power to control it, to hold the darkness at bay, to stop the library from feeding. Could he do it? Could he take the role of the Keeper and stop others from suffering the same fate? The book seemed to grow heavier in his hands. His heart pounded in his chest. But then, he remembered something. Ms. Langley. She had known the truth. She had been part of the cycle. Was it possible she had become the previous keeper? Had she chosen to stay and protect those who would come after her? Or had she been trapped just like all the others? No, Elliot couldn't stay. He wouldn't. His fingers clenched around the book, and with all his strength, he slammed it shut. The room shook. The hum grew deafening, and the shadows leapt toward him with terrifying speed. The pedestal cracked, its runes dissolving into dust. The voices screamed, but Elliot was already running. The door he had come through was gone, replaced by a solid stone wall. No time to think. No time to... A roar filled the chamber. The shadows closed in on him, and he felt them tugging at his soul, pulling him back. He stumbled forward through the darkness toward the only thing that remained, the exit, the library. There was no turning back. Elliot's lungs burned as he ran, his feet pounding the cold stone floor of the chamber. The shadows surged after him, snapping at his heels, but he didn't dare look back. He couldn't. If he did, he knew it would be the end of him. The walls of the chamber closed in, the oppressive darkness tightening around him like a vice. The whispers were maddening now, a constant, shrill din in his ears, urging him to stop, to give in. But he kept running. His fingers brushed the rough edges of the stone walls, his mind racing. How could he escape? How? Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a flicker of light. He didn't hesitate. He darted toward the glow, heart hammering in his chest. It was faint at first, a mere speck in the all-encompassing dark, but as he drew closer, it grew brighter. The light was coming from an archway at the far end of the chamber. He pushed himself harder, his legs screaming, but he couldn't stop. Not now, not when he was so close. The air grew colder, more suffocating, but the light felt warm. Safe. He reached the archway. His hand grasped the stone frame, but the moment he touched it, a sharp pain shot through his body, searing like fire. He gasped, but the pain wasn't enough to stop him. With a cry, he pulled himself through. For a moment, everything was pure, blinding white. The light swallowed him whole, and the world seemed to disappear. And then, with a sudden lurch, Elliot found himself back in the library. But it wasn't the same. The air was thick with an unsettling silence. The shelves were still and empty. The book-lined aisles stretched endlessly before him, but there was no sound, no movement. It was as if the library was holding its breath, waiting. Elliot stood, trembling, as his surroundings slowly came into focus. The oppressive darkness that had once filled the space was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. The shadows no longer crept along the walls. The cold had dissipated, but something felt wrong. The library was different. He looked around, and for the first time, he realized just how empty it was. There were no patrons, no familiar faces. The place was desolate. The books, which had once seemed alive, now appeared lifeless. The covers were dull and faded, the pages brittle and yellowed. The oppressive weight of the library's presence had lifted, but something was still off. Elliot's mind reeled as he tried to make sense of what had happened. The keeper's chamber, the choice, the escape. Was it all real? Or had he somehow fallen into another part of the library, trapped in a different dimension of its endless labyrinth? A soft, rustling sound behind him made him freeze. His pulse shot through the roof. He slowly turned around, but there was no one there. Yet the whispers returned, faint but growing louder. You cannot escape. The voice, distant but unmistakable, whispered through the silence. Elliot's blood ran cold. It was the voice from the book. The voice of the keeper. No, not again, he murmured, backing away, his heart thumping in his chest. I'm free. I made it out. But the voice came again, growing stronger, echoing in his mind. The library calls. You cannot escape. The story must be written. The walls of the library seemed to stretch out even further now, the shelves becoming impossibly tall, stretching beyond his vision. The floor beneath his feet seemed to pulse, like the library itself was alive. A feeling of being trapped returned, settling deep in his bones. The book, the one he had thrown across the room earlier, was suddenly before him. It hovered in the air like a beacon, its pages fluttering as if it had a life of its own. Elliot staggered back, shaking his head in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. He had escaped the keeper's grasp. He had escaped the library. But as he turned to run, his body stiffened, caught in some invisible force. The light from the book began to glow brighter, illuminating the dark corners of the library. You cannot leave. The voice was louder now, clearer. The library is your destiny. It was always your destiny. Elliot struggled against the unseen force, his limbs heavy as if weighed down by the very air around him. And then a cold, horrifying realization struck him. The library was never just a place. It was a trap for souls who sought knowledge, for those who dared to uncover its secrets. It wasn't a library in the traditional sense. It was a living being, a parasitic entity that consumed the lives of anyone who sought to understand it. And Elliot had become part of it. You have chosen. The voice echoed around him, now like a chorus of others, layered on top of one another. You are the keeper now. The library will never let you go. Elliot opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. His vision blurred, the library spinning around him, and the voices seemed to converge into one single, unified entity. The book hovered closer to him, its pages glowing with an unnatural light. Before he could resist, before he could fight back, the book slammed open in his hands once more. The whispers turned into a deafening roar. Welcome home. Elliot's body stiffened as the book's pages seemed to draw him in, pulling him closer to the abyss that awaited him in its darkened pages. He tried to scream, tried to fight the invisible force that gripped him, but the words caught in his throat. The library around him seemed to expand, grow larger and more oppressive, as if it were closing in on him, folding inward like a great beast preparing to devour him whole. The book's pages continued to flip faster and faster, their edges glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. You are no longer Elliot. The voice was colder now, no longer the whisper it had been. It was strong, authoritative, ancient. You belong to the library now. He could feel it, the weight of the words, the truth of them sinking deep into his bones. He was part of the library. There was no escape, no way out. The very essence of the place had already begun to seep into him, into his soul. But even in the face of this overwhelming force, a spark of defiance remained. The part of him that was still Elliot fought back, struggling against the pull, against the growing compulsion to read, to absorb the words that now flowed across the book's pages. He couldn't give in. Not like this. You will read. The voice was louder now, a guttural command that seemed to rattle the very walls of the library. The stories must be written. The library must feed. Elliot's hand, still gripping the book, trembled as he tried to turn away, to rip the pages from the book, to break free. But his fingers no longer obeyed him. The book began to pull him, guiding his hand, forcing his eyes to lock onto the words, to consume them. The text twisted before him, shapes and symbols shifting like shadows, images flashing through his mind, stories of those who had come before him. People lost to the library, trapped in its eternal maze of books. They had all chosen to read. They had all become part of its collection. Elliot could feel them now, feel their presence, their souls flickering in the pages. They were trapped, bound to the library forever. And soon, he would be one of them. The pull grew stronger, and as he struggled, a voice, familiar and distant, echoed through his mind. Elliot, don't give in. His heart skipped a beat. Ms. Langley, he thought, though the words barely formed his mind. You must remember, her voice was a whisper, faint but clear. The library isn't just a prison. It's a power. And you can control it. The words broke through the fog in his mind, and for a brief moment, Elliot's hand stopped trembling. Control? Could it be possible? Was there a way to use the library's power to escape this fate? Yes. The voice grew stronger, more urgent. You are the keeper now. You have the power to stop the library's hunger. You can choose to end it. But you must remember who you are. You must make the right choice. Elliot's eyes darted to the book again. The words had changed. They were no longer cryptic or foreign. They were his own name, his own story, written in ink. He could feel the library's presence pushing against him, try to force him to read, to accept the role, to become one with the collection. But Ms. Langley's voice was still there, like a lifeline pulling him back from a break. The whispers of the library grew louder, more demanding. You cannot escape. The words were now a roar in his ears. But through the noise, Elliot focused on the last thing MS. Langley had said control. He had to control the library. He had to remember who he was. He gripped the book tighter, his fingers digging into its cover, and with everything he had, he willed the book to stop. He commanded it to stop. The room seemed to freeze. The library fell silent. And then, in that eerie stillness, Elliot felt something, an immense power, surging through his veins. It was like the very air in the library had changed, and the weight that had been pressing down on him, the library's hunger began to lift. The book in his hands was no longer a force of destruction. It was now a key that could unlock the power that had bound him. Elliot took a deep breath. He closed his eyes and steadied himself. I am not part of the collection. His voice was shaky but strong, as if a new clarity was beginning to form inside him. I'm not your keeper. The book responded, its pages trembling as if it were alive, unwilling to give up its claim on him. But Elliot could feel the power coursing through him. He was the keeper now, but he didn't have to let the library consume him. He didn't have to become a part of it. With a fierce, guttural cry, he slammed the book shut. The library shuddered. The walls trembled, the shadows retreated, and the whispers died down. The oppressive weight that had suffocated him vanished, replaced by a flicker of something almost like freedom. But it wasn't over. Elliot could feel it now. The true power of the library wasn't just in the books. It was in the people it trapped, the souls that had been lost to its hunger. He could sense their presence, their voices, but they weren't lost anymore. He was their keeper now, in control of the library's fate. And with that power came the responsibility to make sure the cycle didn't continue. He would stop the library's hunger once and for all. He would break the chains of the keeper and protect anyone who came looking for answers. But there was no escaping it. The library was part of him now, and he was part of it. His choice was clear. The library would be his to command. And with that command, he would rewrite the story. The silence was thick like the calm after a storm, but there was something else, something unnatural in the stillness. The library felt different now. Elliot could feel it in his bones. It was no longer an overwhelming presence, but rather a quiet, watchful force. A dormant beast, waiting for him to make the next move. He stood alone, the book still clutched in his hands. The words on the pages now seemed to glow with a subdued light. Their once shifting letters, now still and unreadable. He had closed it, but he could feel it pulsing with energy beneath his fingertips. He had stopped it. He had taken control. But the library was not an entity to be tamed so easily. He could sense the hunger, lurking beneath the surface, ever so patient. He had sealed the book, but that didn't mean the battle was won. You are the keeper now. The voice returned, low and steady, as if it were waiting for him to act. But your power is still fragile. The library does not forgive. It does not forget. Elliot's heart raced as the words settled in his mind. The weight of them was undeniable. He had taken on a mantle of the keeper, but that didn't mean he had the strength to hold it. You will learn, Elliot. The voice was no longer as cruel as before. Instead, it carried a hint of approval. The library is vast. You will need to understand its power before it consumes you, as it has consumed so many others. He looked around, his eyes sweeping across the rows of bookshelves. The endless labyrinth of pages, of lost stories, of souls trapped in eternal wait. The power of the library was boundless, and now it was his to control. But how? His fingers tightened around the book, and in that instant, a strange sensation swept over him, a cold shiver that crawled up his spine. He could feel the walls around him shifting. The library was reacting to his presence, like a living thing, sensing his control. He wasn't just a keeper of knowledge. He was a guardian. But how could he guard something so vast, so hungry? The ground trembled beneath him, and the light around him seemed to flicker. No, he whispered to himself, his voice determined. I won't let it take anyone else. I'll stop this. The whispers returned, but they weren't as loud now. They were softer, almost hesitant, as if the library was waiting for his next decision. The book in his hands seemed to grow heavier. The weight of its power pressed down on him, but now he felt the strength to bear it. His mind was clearer, sharper. He could feel the pulse of the library's energy, like a heartbeat resonating in his chest. The connection was undeniable now. He was part of it, and with that came an understanding. But there was no time to waste. Elliot had learned the library's secret, but that didn't mean he knew how to wield its power. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes, reaching out with his mind, feeling for the center of the library, the heart of its endless network. He felt the pulse of countless stories, each one trying to push through, trying to escape. Souls long forgotten, trapped in an endless loop of pages and ink. He could feel the Keeper's essence within them, the remnants of those who had come before him, each one bound to the library for eternity, their identities and memories slipping away, consumed by the need to preserve its infinite collection. Elliot reached further, extending his will into the library, letting his mind merge with its vast expanse. The power within him grew as he tapped into the source. He could feel the temptation to lose himself in the stories, every story that had ever been written, every soul that had ever been trapped. It was all within his grasp, within his control, but he refused to give in. He was no longer a prisoner. Elliot, you have begun your journey. The voice came again, but this time it felt less oppressive. There was respect in its tone. The library has many paths, and you have the power to choose. Elliot opened his eyes. The library around him was no longer a chaotic maze of shadows and endless corridors. It was still vast, still infinite, but now he felt connected to it. The shelves no longer seemed to overwhelm him. They were simply there, waiting to be explored. I'll choose my path. Elliot said aloud, his voice firm. I'll guard this place, but I won't let it consume me. I won't let it consume anyone else. The book in his hands flared with light, and the library responded. The shelves seemed to shift, and in the distance, he saw a faint outline of a doorway, an exit. But was it truly an exit? Or was it another trick? You must decide, Keeper. The voice murmured, now like a distant echo. What will you do with the power you now hold? Will you allow others to find their way here, or will you protect them from its hunger? The weight of the decision bore down on him. He had power now, yes, but with that power came a responsibility greater than anything he had ever known. Could he protect the world from the library's pull, or would he fail, like all the others? His fingers tightened around the book, and for the first time since he had entered the library, he felt the fear and doubt begin to fade away. He wasn't alone anymore. The power he held wasn't just his. It was shared by those who had come before him, and with their collective strength, he could change the library's future. The hum of the library, once a threat, now seemed like a song, a melody that resonated with his heartbeat. He could hear the stories, the lives, the souls bound to the shelves, but instead of hearing their cries for release, he felt their support. I will stop the cycle, he whispered, I will protect those who wander here, and I will rewrite the stories of those who have been lost. The book flared with light again, brighter than ever. And this time, Elliot smiled. For the first time, the library felt like home. The library remained still, waiting. Elliot could feel its pulse, like a great beast resting beneath his feet, its hunger subdued for now. But he knew it wouldn't last forever. The library was patient, its existence stretching beyond time itself. And though he had taken control, it was only a matter of time before it tested him. He turned toward the faint doorway that had appeared in the distance. It was shimmering, almost like a mirage, a hazy outline against the endless rows of shelves. Was it truly an exit, or was it another trick? Another story waiting to be written? As he stepped forward, the air shifted. The silence, once comforting, became unnerving. A faint rustling sound echoed through the aisles. Elliot froze. He wasn't alone. From the far end of the library, the rustling grew louder, like pages turning in rapid succession. Then a soft voice, fragile, distant, whispered through the air. "Help me." His breath hitched. The voice wasn't the same as the one that had guided him before. It was weaker, desperate. A flicker of movement caught his eye between the towering shelves. Someone was here. Elliot's grip on the book tightened as he stepped cautiously toward the sound. His mind raced. Was this another test? Another illusion conjured by the library? Or had someone else stumbled into its grasp? As he turned the corner of a towering bookshelf, he saw her. A girl, no older than 14, stood frozen in the dim light. Her clothes were faded, her long dark hair tangled, and her wide, terrified eyes darted around as if searching for something or someone. Elliot took a slow step forward. "Hey," he said softly. "Are you okay?" The girl's gaze snapped to him, and for a moment, she hesitated. Then she took a stumbling step backward, shaking her head violently. "And no," she stammered. "It won't let me leave. It keeps changing." Elliot's heart clenched. He knew exactly what she meant. "How long have you been here?" he asked. I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I try to find a way out, but every time I turn around, the shelves move. The doors disappear. The books whisper things, and when I try to read them, I forget why I'm here." She hugged herself tightly, her small frame trembling. "I don't want to forget anymore." Elliot swallowed hard. This was it, his first test as the keeper. The library had claimed many before, and it was clear that this girl was on the verge of being lost to its hunger. He could feel the way the shadows clung to her, the way the books seemed to call to her, pulling at her mind, twisting her sense of time. But she wasn't gone. Not yet. "You don't have to be afraid," Elliot said, stepping closer. "I can help you." The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "You can." "Yes," he said, more confident now. "But you have to trust me." The library around them seemed to shift again, as if listening, as if waiting to see what he would do. The girl hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "But you have to trust me." The library around them seemed to shift again, as if listening, as if waiting to see what he would do. The girl hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Okay." Elliot took a deep breath and focused. He could feel the library's presence pressing in, testing his resolve. It wanted to see if he truly understood his new role. He closed his eyes, reaching out, not with his hands, but with his mind. The bookshelves trembled, their towering forms twisting, shifting like living things. He could feel the way the library had wrapped around this girl, trapping her in its maze, feeding off her confusion. But he was the keeper now, and he wouldn't let it take her. He focused on her presence, on the way she stood in the heart of the labyrinth. Then, with a silent command, he willed the library to open a path. A gust of air swept through the shelves, and then, just ahead of them, a doorway appeared. A real one. The girl gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. You did that. Elliot nodded. Let's go. He reached for her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Together, they stepped toward the doorway, the flickering light beyond it offering a glimpse of the world outside. The library groaned in protest, the shelves shuddering as if trying to hold onto its prize. But Elliot didn't stop. He pulled the girl through the threshold, and suddenly they were outside. The air was cold, fresh. The sky stretched above them in a deep midnight blue, the stars burning brightly. Elliot turned, expecting to see the massive entrance of the library behind him. But there was nothing, only an empty street, the distant glow of streetlights, and the faint hum of the real world moving forward, unaware of what had just happened. The girl turned in a frantic circle. It's gone, she whispered. Elliot exhaled. Yeah. She looked up at him, eyes still wide with disbelief. Who are you? For a long moment, Elliot didn't answer. He wasn't the same person who had wandered into the library, searching for answers. He was something different now. Finally, he smiled. I'm the keeper. The street was eerily quiet. The girl, Elliot still didn't know her name, stood beside him, arms wrapped around herself, as if afraid that at any moment the library would pull her back. Elliot felt it too. Though they had left the library's domain, its presence still lingered like a whisper in the back of his mind. He wasn't entirely free of it, not that he ever would be. He had claimed its power, and now it was bound to him. And yet, something felt off. He glanced at the girl, studying her closely. Her clothes were old-fashioned, faded denim overalls over a striped sweater, sneakers scuffed and worn. She looked like she had been wandering for weeks. How long do you think you were in there? He asked. She hesitated. I told you, I don't know. Elliot nodded, but a cold realization slithered through him. If time moved strangely inside the library, then how much had passed while she was inside? His gaze flickered to the street, to the buildings that lined it. It looked the same, but something about it felt different. Was it just in his head, or... What's your name? He asked. The girl swallowed, as if forcing herself to remember. Claire. Elliot offered her a small smile. Claire. Okay. He gestured to the sidewalk. Come on, let's get away from here. She hesitated, but nodded, following as they started down the empty street. Elliot had no idea where they were going. He just needed to move, to put some distance between them and whatever lingering influence the library still had. As they walked, Claire finally broke the silence. You're different, she said. Elliot frowned. What do you mean? The library didn't let people leave before, she murmured. Not really, but you. Changed something. Elliot felt the weight of the book still tucked under his arm. He had felt it, too, the shift in the library's power, the way it had almost. Listen to him. I don't know what I did, he admitted, but I think I have control now. Claire shivered. I don't think it's done with you. Neither did he. As they turned the corner, a neon sign flickered up ahead, an old diner, its windows still glowing in the darkness. Elliot's stomach twisted with hunger. He hadn't eaten since. His steps slowed. Since when? He tried to remember. Before the library. Before he had stepped into that building. But his memories were foggy, blurred at the edges, like ink bleeding through old paper. How long had he been in there? Elliot. Claire's voice was small, uncertain. He forced a smile. Come on, let's get some food. The bell above the diner door jingled as they stepped inside. The warmth hit Elliot immediately, the smell of coffee, bacon grease, and something sweet. A radio played softly from behind the counter, some old song he couldn't quite place. A waitress, a woman with tired eyes and curly hair, glanced up from where she was pouring coffee. Her brow furrowed. Well, I'll be, she said. Where have you two been hiding? Elliot's stomach dropped. Claire stiffened beside him. The woman set down the coffee pot and stepped closer, studying them both. You look like you've seen a ghost. Elliot swallowed. How long have we been gone? She frowned. Gone. Something cold coiled in his gut. The woman glanced toward the old clock on the wall, then back at them. "Kid, I just saw you yesterday." Claire let out a sharp breath. Elliot's skin prickled. Yesterday? That wasn't possible. He turned to Claire, but her face had gone pale. "I wasn't in there for just one day," she whispered. "I wasn't." Elliot clenched his fists. He could still feel the weight of the book in his arms, the knowledge pressing against his mind. Something wasn't right. Time hadn't moved the way it should have. Had they left the library? Or had the library followed them? The waitress was still watching them, suspicion flickering in her tired eyes. Elliot forced a smile. "Yeah, sorry. Long night." The woman didn't look convinced, but she sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. "Well, you both look like you could use a meal. Grab a seat." Claire hesitated, then moved toward a booth near the window. Elliot followed, sliding in across from her. The diner felt real. The sound of the radio, the hum of the neon sign, the clatter of plates from the kitchen. But Elliot couldn't shake the feeling in his gut. Had they truly escaped? Or was this just another story waiting to be written? As he reached for the menu, something caught his eye. A book, sitting on the table. Small, bound in worn leather. Not his book. His breath hitched. Claire noticed his stare and followed his gaze. When she saw it, her face went white. Elliot's hands trembled as he reached for the cover. Slowly, carefully, he flipped it open. There, written in looping ink on the first page, was a single sentence: "The keeper always returns." Elliot's heart pounded. They had never left. The library was still watching, and the story wasn't over. Elliot's breath hitched as he stared at the book. The words on the page blurred slightly, as if they were shifting, waiting for him to read them properly. "The keeper always returns." A cold dread crept up his spine. Claire sat frozen across from him, her eyes locked onto the book as though it might come alive at any moment. Her voice wavered. "I thought we got out." Elliot swallowed hard. "So did I." His fingers hovered over the book's pages, hesitating. It looked real enough, old, bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with time. But something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. He could feel the library's presence radiating from it. A tether, a reminder. They weren't free. The waitress returned, setting down 2 glasses of water and a worn-out notepad. She didn't seem to notice the book sitting between them. "What can I get you to?" she asked, flipping to a blank page. Elliot tried to steady his voice. Pancakes and coffee." The woman nodded and turned to Claire, who barely seemed to hear her. "Aunt," Claire snapped out her daze. The same." The waitress jotted it down. "All right, I'll be right back." She walked away, the bell above the kitchen door jingling as she disappeared behind the counter. Elliot let out a slow breath and looked back at Claire. "We need to figure out what's going on," he said, keeping his voice low. "If we never actually left, then where are we?" Claire gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "This looks like the real world. It feels real." Elliot considered that. It did feel real. The warmth of the diner, the smell of coffee and syrup, the quiet hum of the jukebox in the corner. But now that he was paying attention, something about it felt staged, like a story trying too hard to convince him it was real. His gaze flicked back to the book. Maybe it held the answer. Elliot hesitated only a moment before flipping to the next page. More words were written in the same looping script. A keeper must understand his cage before he can escape it. His pulse quickened. The library wasn't trying to trap him. It was testing him. His hands trembled as he turned another page. The ink twisted and formed new words before his eyes. "Find the cracks, and you'll find the way out." Cracks. Elliot looked up sharply, his mind racing. If this wasn't the real world, then there had to be inconsistencies. Mistakes. Glitches in the illusion. He turned to Claire, about to speak, and then he saw it. Behind her, in the reflection of the diner's window, the outside world wasn't moving. The street was still. The trees outside were frozen mid-sway, as if caught in a paused video. Even the flickering neon sign wasn't actually flickering. The light simply hung there, unchanging. His breath hitched. "Claire," he whispered. She frowned. "What?" He lifted a shaky finger and pointed behind her. She turned, and then she saw. Her face drained of color. The world outside was a still image, like a page in a book. Her lips parted in a silent gasp, and Elliot could see the panic rising in her eyes. "No," she breathed. "No, no, no." The diner's lights flickered. Elliot's heartbeat pounded in his ears. The illusion was breaking. They had noticed. The waitress returned, but something was wrong with her now. Her movements were stiff, unnatural. And then she spoke, but not in her voice. Not in any voice. The sound that came out was like rustling pages, whispering voices overlapping, hundreds of them speaking at once. Elliot shot to his feet, grabbing Claire's wrist. "Run!" The diner shuddered. The walls rippled, the ceiling twisting like melting wax. The floor beneath them stretched, the checkered tiles warping as the illusion collapsed. They bolted for the door. The bell above the entrance screamed as they pushed through, and suddenly, the street was moving again. The world snapped back into motion. The wind rushed past them. Car engines hummed in the distance. The neon sign flickered normally again. Everything looked right, but Elliot knew better. The book in his hand was proof. The library wasn't done with him. Claire gasped for breath beside him. What just happened?" Elliot turned the book over in his hands, his stomach twisting. "We're still inside," he murmured. "It's just changing the story." Claire shuddered. "So what do we do?" Elliot looked up at the sky. It stretched on forever, stars twinkling like tiny pinpricks in an ink-black canvas. But something about it felt off, too, like it was watching them. He clenched the book tighter. "We find the cracks," he said, "and we break out for real." But deep down, a horrifying thought clawed at the back of his mind. What if there was no way out? The night air was crisp, but Elliot felt no relief in the open street. The weight of the book in his hands anchored him to a terrible truth, one that made his skin crawl. They were still in the library. It had let them think they escaped, let them believe they had broken free. But the illusion was cracking. Claire stood beside him, her breath shallow, her arms wrapped around herself. "I don't know how much more of this I can take." Elliot forced himself to stay calm. "We'll get out." She let out a dry, bitter laugh. "You keep saying that, but what if," she hesitated, swallowed hard. "What if this is just what happens? What if nobody ever really leaves?" Elliot didn't have an answer. Instead, he turned back to the book. It had given him a clue. Find the cracks. If this world was fake, there had to be more mistakes, more places where reality didn't hold together. His eyes scanned the street, the flickering lamplights, the empty sidewalks. Everything looked normal now, but the diner had seemed real too, until it wasn't. Think, Elliot, how do you break out a story? His grip tightened on the book. "We need to push it." Claire frowned. "Push what?" "The illusion." He turned to her, heart pounding. "If this world is just a story, then what happens when we do something that doesn't fit?" Claire stared at him, hesitant. Then, slowly, her expression hardened. "Like breaking the rules?" Elliot nodded. "Exactly." She took a deep breath. "So, what do we do?" Elliot glanced around, searching for something, anything, that felt too controlled, too perfect. Then he spotted it. Across the street, a man was walking down the sidewalk. He was wearing a dark gray suit, a fedora tilted over his face. There was nothing remarkable about him, except for one thing. He had passed under the same flickering street lamp 3 times. Elliot's breath caught. It wasn't a loop. It wasn't rewinding. It was just repeating, like a poorly written background character, set to move along a fixed path. Elliot's pulse quickened. That was a crack. "Come on," he whispered, already moving. Claire followed without hesitation. The man continued walking, oblivious, his shoes tapping rhythmically against the pavement. Elliot waited, counting the steps. 1, 2, 3. The man passed under the light. 1, 2, 3. The same streetlight. Again, Elliot stepped directly into his path. The man stopped immediately. His head didn't turn. His body didn't shift. He just stopped moving, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Claire let out a shaky breath. Oh my God. Elliot reached out, hand trembling, and nudged the man's shoulder. The figure toppled, completely rigid like a mannequin. He hit the pavement with a sickening thud. Claire clamped a hand over her mouth. Elliot's stomach lurched. He knelt beside the fallen man, hesitating only a second before carefully tilting back his hat. His breath caught in his throat. The man had no face, just smooth, featureless skin. Claire made a strangled noise, stumbling backward. Nope, I hate this. Elliot's mind reeled. This wasn't just a trick, this world was unfinished. It was breaking. The ground trembled beneath them. Claire grabbed his arm. I think we just pissed it off. Elliot barely had time to react before a terrible sound ripped through the air. A deafening, turning page sound, like thousands of books being flipped at once. The streetlights flickered violently. The air rippled. And then, everything shifted. The sidewalk cracked beneath them. The sky overhead ripped like paper, splitting open to reveal nothingness. Buildings melted into words, black ink bleeding into the ground. The world around them was collapsing, folding in on itself, like pages being turned backward. The library wasn't just erasing them. It was rewriting the story. Elliot grabbed Claire's hand and ran. The world warped around them, streets twisting, buildings stretching, the sky flickering between reality and endless parchment. The book in his hand burned. He didn't dare stop. A door appeared in the distance. A grand, ornate doorway, standing in the middle of the dissolving street. The exit. It had to be. Elliot ran faster, yanking Claire forward as the ground beneath him peeled away. The whispers grew louder. The keeper always returns. The keeper always returns. No, ellos groled. Not this time. They reached the door. Elliot didn't hesitate. He grabbed the handle and pulled. White lights swallowed them whole. Elliot's breath left him in a rush as the lights swallowed them. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no gravity, just an endless, weightless void. Then, his feet slammed on his solid ground. He gasped, nearly stumbling. His body felt intact, but something was wrong. The air was too still. Claire was beside him, clutching her chest, her breaths ragged. Did we make it? Elliot turned, trying to get his bearings. They were standing in a vast, empty space. A room, but not a normal one. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, all white, stretching infinitely in every direction. No doors, no windows, no shadows, just blankness. Claire turned in slow circles, eyes wide with fear. What is this place? Elliot swallowed hard. I don't know. The book was still in his hands. He flipped it open, half expecting more warnings, but the pages were blank now. The ink was gone. The book had stopped telling the story. Which meant, Claire took a step back. Elliot. Her voice was small. He looked up and saw the figure standing before them. A man. No, not a man. Something wearing the shape of one. Tall, draped in black, its face half-formed, shifting between features like a painting that refused to dry. Its eyes were empty ink wells, deep and fathomless. It stared at them without blinking. Elliot's hands clenched into fists. Who are you? The figure tilted its head. When it spoke, its voice didn't belong to one person. It belonged to many. I'm the one who writes. Elliot's breath caught. Claire went stiff beside him. The figure drifted closer, its movement smooth, unnatural. You have gone further than most. Elliot swallowed. We're leaving. The figure let out a soft, almost amused hum. You already have. Elliot froze. Claire's hands trembled. What? The figure gestured to the endless white around them. You broke free from the illusion. The story has ended. Elliot didn't trust it. His instinct screamed at him that something was wrong. "If we're free," he said carefully, "then where are we?" The figure smiled. "You are in the space between stories." The air grew colder. Elliot's pulse thundered. "You hold the book," the figure continued, nodding toward Elliot's hands. "You turn the last page. And now, there is nothing left to read." Elliot looked down at the book again. The empty pages, the silence pressing in. Claire shook her head violently. No, that's not how this works. There has to be a way back." The figure regarded her curiously. "You misunderstand." It took another step forward. "The library does not simply hold stories. It creates them." Elliot's mouth went dry. "You broke free of one story," the figure said, "but you must belong to another." The floor beneath them rippled. The air thickened. Elliot gritted his teeth. "You're saying we have to choose a story?" The figure's inky smile widened. "Or be forgotten." A chill stabbed through Elliot's spine. He turned to Claire. She looked just as horrified as he felt. "I don't want me trapped again," she whispered. Neither did Elliot. But the white void stretched on forever. There was no way out, only forward. The figure lifted a hand. A book appeared in its grasp. A new one. Dark, leather-bound, its pages shimmering with unwritten words. Everything rushed forward, pages flipping, ink bleeding into new shapes, new places. Elliot didn't want to take it. Didn't want to play into whatever this thing's game was. But when he looked around at the endless void, at the way the space itself wavered, he knew he had no choice. His story wasn't over. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and took the book. The moment his fingers touched the cover, the world collapsed. And then, the world reset. The smell of old paper filled his lungs. The flickering light of the library's grand chandeliers cast long shadows over endless rows of shelves. Elliot stood in the center of it all. The library, the beginning of a new story. Claire was beside him, breathing hard. The book was open in his hands now. And on the first page, written in looping ink, Chapter 1. Elliot closed his eyes. He understood now. The library had never been a prison. It was a cycle. And now, he was the one writing the story. Elliot's breath hitched as he stared at the first page. The words had formed on their own. Chapter 1. This wasn't the old book, the one that had led them through the nightmare. This was something new, and it was waiting for him to write it. Claire's voice was barely above a whisper. "Elliot, what does this mean?" He turned the page. Blank. Then, ink bled onto the paper, forming words, curling in perfect script. The keeper must begin the tale. A cold realization settled in his chest. He swallowed. "I think I'm supposed to write what happens next." Claire took a step back, her hands curling into fists. No, we're not playing this game." She turned, scanning the towering shelves. There has to be a way out. There has to be. Elliot wanted to believe that. But deep down, he already knew the truth. This wasn't a trap anymore. It was a role, a responsibility. The library had chosen him. He looked at the book again. The ink shifted, forming a new line. Tell the story or let it end. His fingers tightened on the cover. If he didn't write, what would happen? Would the world just stop? Would he and Claire simply fade, becoming lost in this place forever? Claire's voice cut through his thoughts. "We are not staying here, Elliot." But how could they leave if they weren't in a story anymore? The library had no exit, not unless it was written into existence. His heart pounded. Maybe I can write us out, he muttered. Maybe I can change the story. Claire hesitated, hope flickering in her eyes. Elliot took a deep breath and gripped the quill. Slowly, carefully, he pressed it to the first blank page and wrote. Elliot and Claire stood in the library, the weight of endless stories pressing in around them. But they were not trapped. The door to the real world was waiting just beyond the next shelf. The ink sank into the page, and then the air shimmered. Claire gasped. A door had appeared. A simple wooden door, right between two towering bookshelves where there had been nothing before. Elliot's pulse raced. It had worked. Claire grabbed his arm. "Come on, let's go." She ran toward it, but Elliot hesitated. The book in his hands trembled, as if something deep within the pages was watching. The library had given him power. A part of him wondered, feared, what would happen if he walked away from it? What if he was meant to stay? What if leaving meant losing something important? The ink twisted on the page again. A new sentence appeared. "A keeper always returns." Elliot's grip tightened. He met Claire's eyes. Then, without another word, he slammed the book shut and stepped through the door. The moment Elliot stepped through the door, he felt weightless, like ink bleeding from a page, dissolving into something new. Then, his feet hit solid ground, rushing into his lungs. The scent of wet pavement and city air filled his senses. Lights, sounds. He was back. Claire stood beside him, chest rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths. Her hands clenched into fists, as if she was afraid she'd slip through reality again. The street was empty. Late at night. Familiar. They were standing just outside the library. Not the impossible, endless one. The normal library. The one in their real world. Claire let out a shaky laugh. "We did it. We're back." Elliot wasn't sure what to say. His mind still felt stretched, like a part of him had been left inside those twisting, endless halls. Then he realized he was still holding the book. His stomach dropped. It hadn't stayed behind. Slowly, he turned it over in his hands. The dark leather cover was blank now, except for a single embossed title. The Keeper's Story. His story. Claire followed his gaze and immediately took a step back. Nope. Throw it away. Elliot swallowed hard. Could he just leave it behind? He didn't get the chance to decide, because the book flipped open on its own. The pages turned rapidly, stopping at the last written sentence. "A keeper always returns." Elliot's pulse hammered. The words shifted, reshaping into something new. Not all stories end when you close the book. The air around him suddenly felt too thick. A sound whispered through the night, like pages being turned in the wind. Elliot's hands trembled. He had left the library, but the library had not left him. Claire grabbed his wrist. Elliot. A shadow moved behind them. Not a person, not an object. Just a shadow, stretching long and thin, reaching toward them like an ink stain seeping across the pavement. And then the page turned again. New words appeared, as if written by an invisible hand. The Keeper's story had only just begun. Elliot barely had time to react before. The shadow lunged. Elliot staggered back as the shadow lunged. It moved like ink spilling across the pavement, stretching toward him, shifting, twisting alive. Claire yanked him away just in time. "Run!" They bolted down the sidewalk, the book still clutched in Elliot's hands, its pages fluttering wildly as if the words inside were trying to escape. The streets were empty, too empty. No cars, no people, no sound except their frantic footsteps and the horrible whispering that followed them. The same whispering they had heard in the library. The keeper always returns. Elliot risked a glance over his shoulder. The shadow was spreading, growing, shifting along the pavement like something was writing it into existence. "This isn't happening," Claire gasped, voice tight with panic. "We got out. We were out." Elliot knew, but the book hadn't stayed behind. And as long as the book existed, so did the story. His heart pounded. They needed shelter. He spotted a narrow alley ahead and pulled Claire toward it. They ducked inside, pressing themselves against the cold brick wall. Silence. Elliot's breath came in short gasps. His pulse roared in his ears. For a moment, nothing moved. The shadows on the street stood still. Claire covered her mouth, forcing herself to stay silent. Elliot's fingers tightened around the book. It wanted something from him. The words inside were waiting. Slowly, dreading what he might see, he opened it. A new sentence had appeared. The keeper could only run for so long. His stomach turned to ice. Claire saw it too. She shook her head wildly. Elliot, don't read it too late. The alley around them shuddered. The shadows rushed forward, and everything went dark. Elliot's eyes snapped open. He wasn't anywhere. The world around him was white. Not empty, not a room. Just white. A void. His heart pounded. Claire. No answer. He turned in a circle. Nothing. No Claire. No buildings. No sound. But the book was still in his hands. His fingers trembled as he flipped it open. All except for a single, handwritten line. "Welcome back, Keeper." Elliot's breath hitched. "No," he whispered. No. He had escaped. Hadn't he? The book trembled. And then a new line formed beneath the first. Shall we begin the next story? Elliot's blood turned to ice. Because this time, the book wasn't asking. It was waiting for him to write. Elliot's hands shook as he stared at the book. The pages were blank, except for the words that had just appeared. Shall we begin the next story? His breath came fast and uneven. This wasn't a library. This wasn't a real world. This was somewhere in between. A space that should not exist. A space where he should not exist. His grip tightened on the book. "No," he whispered. "I'm not doing this. I'm not playing your game." The book trembled. The white void around him seemed to pulse, like the inhale of something alive. Then, a new line of text bled onto the page, the ink forming slowly, deliberately. A keeper who refuses to write is nothing at all. A shiver ran down Elliot's spine. The words twisted, shifting into something else. Ink or oblivion. Choose. His fingers curled into fists. This wasn't a choice. It was a threat. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to think. If this place was part of the story, if it was still following the rules, then maybe, just maybe, he could find a way out. He looked down at the empty pages. What if he wrote himself free? Slowly, cautiously, he lifted the quill. His pulse hammered as he pressed the tip against the paper. And then, he wrote. Elliot refused to play the game. He refused to be the keeper. And so, he woke up in the real world, safe and whole, the book gone forever. The ink sank into the page. The void around him shivered. For a moment, everything was still. Then, a new sentence appeared beneath his own. "Nice try, Keeper." Elliot's blood froze. The ink on the page bled, shifting, twisting. And suddenly, the void wasn't empty anymore. A figure stood before him. The same one from before. Tall, shadowed, its face shifting like an unfinished sketch, flickering between features that didn't belong to any one person. Its eyes were nothing but pools of ink. It smiled. "You cannot write yourself out of the story," it murmured. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The book felt heavier in his hands, as if it was sinking, pulling him deeper. "You belong to the words now," the figure whispered. "You are the keeper, and the keeper must tell the tale." Elliot took a step back. "No," he said, voice shaking. "I won't." The figure's smile widened. Then, the book flipped open on its own, the pages turning in a violent blur. And before Elliot could stop it, ink spilled from the pages like liquid darkness. It rushed toward him, curling around his ankles, creeping up his arms. He struggled, but it was too strong. The ink pulled him under. The last thing he heard before the darkness swallowed him whole was the whispering voice of the figure. "Then we shall write it for you." Elliot fell. The ink swallowed him whole, dragging him into its depths. There was no air, no light, only the suffocating weight of words pressing in on him, wrapping around his skin like vines. He tried to struggle, to claw his way out, but the ink pulled him deeper. And then, a single voice echoed in the darkness. Not the whispering figure. Not Claire. His own. The keeper struggled, but the ink was endless. Elliot's breath hitched. The words weren't just being written. They were happening. The ink tightened around his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. He had to stop this. If words had power here, if they were shaping reality, then he had to change them. Through gritted teeth, he forced the words out. The keeper broke free. Nothing happened. The ink climbed higher, filling his mouth, creeping into his ears. Panic shot through him. It wasn't working. Why wasn't it working? Then he realized he wasn't writing the words. He was speaking them, and that wasn't enough. He needed to write. A quill pressed into his fingers. Elliot's eyes widened. He didn't know where it had come from, but he didn't care. His hand shook as he lifted it, struggling against the ink's pull. The quill hovered over the darkness, over what should have been a page. Then, he wrote. The keeper broke free. The ink shuddered. It resisted, and then it let go. Elliot gasped as he burst out of the ink, collapsing on his solid ground. His hands trembled. His lungs burned. His clothes were soaked in black liquid, but he was alive. He looked up. He was back in a library, but it was different this time. The shelves stretched endlessly, twisting in ways that made no sense. The books weren't just stacked, they were floating, shifting midair, rearranging themselves. And at the center of it all, the figure stood waiting. The ink dripped from its form like melting wax. Its eyes were bottomless voids. It tilted its head. "You are learning," it murmured. Elliot's fingers curled into fists. He wasn't playing this game anymore. He was going to win it. He lifted the quill again, his jaw clenched. And this time, he would write his own ending. Elliot stood in the center of the shifting library, the book heavy in his hands, the quill trembling as it hovered above the page. His heart pounded like a drum in his chest. The ink-black figure before him watched silently, its eyes swirling with the emptiness of 1,000 forgotten stories. "You think you can escape me?" It whispered, the voice a mixture of malice and amusement. "You think you can control what was never meant to be controlled?" Elliot didn't respond. The library pulsed around him, the books floating like specters, their titles shifting into unreadable symbols. The walls seemed to warp and stretch, bending the very fabric of reality until everything felt like it was no longer real, like everything was made of ink. The figure took a step forward, its presence filling the space. The weight of its gaze made Elliot's chest tighten. "You've been given the power to write," the figure continued, "but no keeper can break the cycle. You will write, and the words will come to life. And when they do, you will remain here, trapped in the pages you create." Elliot's grip on the book tightened. The quill's tip hovered just above the next blank page, the words pressing on his mind, demanding to be written. But there was one thing the figure didn't understand. He wasn't afraid of the story anymore. He understood it now. The story wasn't just written. It was lived. Elliot took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't going to just write this time. He was going to destroy the story. With a single stroke, he plunged the quill into the paper. And he wrote, "The keeper breaks free from the ink, and the story ends." The words bled out, spreading across the page, the ink spilling like water overflowing from a cracked dam. The entire library shuddered, the shelves quaking as the ink tore through the air, erasing the walls, the books, the figure, everything. The void, the weight of the library's oppressive presence, dissolved. For a moment, Elliot thought it was over. But then, a new sentence appeared on the page, written in ink so dark it seemed to swallow the very light around it. "The story has no end." Elliot's breath caught. He knew this wasn't over. The figure wasn't gone. The library wasn't gone. It was still watching, waiting, and he could feel its cold presence creeping back into the pages. But there was something else now. Something he hadn't noticed before. The book, this cursed, endless book, was starting to crack. Cracks spread across the cover, glowing faintly as the ink writhed inside, fighting to be freed. It was the story fighting to hold on. But as the cracks deepened, the walls of the library themselves began to crack, as if the very structure of reality was breaking apart. Elliot stared at the book, determination in his eyes. This time, He wouldn't just run. He wouldn't hide. He had the power, the quill, and the words. He could rewrite everything. Without hesitation, Elliot slammed the book shut. The cracking sound was deafening. The library ripped apart, the walls and shelves shattering into 1,000 fragments of ink, scattering into nothingness. The figure, its face twisted with rage, began to disintegrate, dissolving into a cloud of ink that faded into the air. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, the world reformed. Elliot blinked. He was back. The real world. Standing on the sidewalk, the familiar hum of the city around him. The library was gone. The book was gone. He glanced at Claire, who was standing beside him, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had been there. She had seen all. But now, it was over. He looked down at his hands. They were clean, no ink, no stains. The quill had vanished. The story, the nightmare, the ink, it was gone. The keeper was no more, and the world could finally breathe again. Elliot stood there, his heart still racing, as the world around him returned to its normal rhythm. The streetlights flickered above, the hum of distant traffic pulsed through the night, and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind was almost too ordinary, too safe. Everything felt as if it had snapped back into place, but a nagging feeling twisted at the back of his mind. Something wasn't quite right. He turned to Claire, who was still standing beside him, her eyes wide and disoriented. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. It was like she was still processing the shift, the same shift he had felt, but couldn't fully explain. "Claire," Elliot whispered, his voice hoarse, unsure if what they had just endured had somehow been a dream. She blinked, her gaze clearing. "Elliot, her voice faltered. She looked at him, searching his face as if trying to find some trace of the nightmare they had just escaped. A silence stretched between them. Then Claire did something that caught Elliot off guard. She reached into her pocket. His pulse quickened, anxiety spiking in his chest. Was it another book? Another quill? Was it all happening again? But no. She pulled out a small, weathered journal. Elliot froze. It looked familiar in a way he couldn't quite place. The leather cover was worn and the edges frayed. Claire didn't say anything, but her fingers traced the spine of the journal as if she were considering something. "What is that?" Elliot asked cautiously. Claire opened the journal, her face darkening as she flipped through its pages. The pages were blank, except for the first one, and as she turned to it, a single line appeared. "The story is never finished." Elliot's blood ran cold. The same words, the same unfinished sentence. But this time, it was in Claire's hands. Elliot reached for it, his fingers trembling. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. Claire didn't answer at first. She swallowed hard, eyes wide, and looked at him with something that felt like guilt. "I found it," she said softly. After you were gone." Elliot's heart dropped. "You were gone for days," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought you'd been lost. But then I found this on your desk. The same book, the same words." Elliot stared at the journal in her hands, the ink beginning to spill across the page, forming new words before his very eyes. He could feel it, the pull of the story. It was alive. And this time, it wasn't his story to write. The figure had been wrong. He hadn't broken free. He had just left the story behind, leaving someone else to take his place. The ink rippled, forming the next line. "The keeper always returns, just in a different form." Elliot's breath caught. No, it couldn't be happening again. But as he watched the words appear, he knew the story had only just begun. The library, the ink, the endless cycle, they weren't gone. They had just moved on, and the keeper was never truly free. Elliot couldn't breathe. The words on the page continued to bleed out, like ink running from an open wound. He wanted to tear the journal from Claire's hands, but he couldn't. The pull was too strong. His fingers hovered near the edges of the page as new lines appeared before his very eyes. It was the same sinister rhythm, the same creeping force that had taken him before. He could hear the faint whispers now, almost inaudible over the steady thrum of his heart. The keeper always returns. But the voice wasn't just in his head. It was in Claire's, too. Her fingers began to flick across the pages, as though compelled. Each word she wrote seemed to pull her in further, her eyes glazing over as the story controlled her, just like it had controlled him. "No," Elliot whispered, his voice barely a breath. "This isn't you." Claire's face was a mask of quiet terror, her hands moving mechanically, her gaze locked onto the page as the ink dripped like blood from the edges of her fingertips. "We can't stop it," she murmured, her voice hollow. "It's already started." Elliot grabbed her wrist, his grip tight. He had to snap her out of it. He had to break the chain. But as soon as his fingers made contact with her skin, something changed. A shockwave passed through him, a force that made his entire body lock. His vision blurred. The world around him flickered. And when he blinked, he wasn't standing on the street anymore. The library had returned. The towering shelves, the endless rows of books, the suffocating weight of ink-laden air. It was all back, as though they had never left. Claire stood before him, but now her eyes were dark, no longer her own. The ink had taken her, just as it had taken him. And, standing in front of them, the figure was waiting. Its form flickered in and out, a shifting silhouette of shadows and ink. "You thought you could break free?" The figure's voice was a low, guttural laugh. "You can't escape what has already been written." Elliot stepped back, panic rising in his throat. He couldn't let this happen again. He had to stop it. But the figure's hand rose, and the page in Claire's journal flipped open on its own. Another line appeared. "The keeper cannot escape the ink, for the ink is eternal." Elliot's heart sank. The words were final, like a verdict. There was no way out. The figure tilted its head, as if savoring Elliot's despair. "The story has claimed you both. You are no longer its masters. You are its servants." Elliot's mind raced. There had to be another way. There had to be something they missed, some loophole, some secret buried in the ink. But as he looked around the library, everything felt like it was closing in on him. The walls, the books, the very air, it was all alive with ink, pulsating with the power of the story. He turned to Claire, her eyes now completely black, void staring back at him. She was no longer Claire. She was a vessel, and the story was controlling her. "No," Elliot breathed. Not again. But as he reached for the journal, another voice rang out in his mind, louder than the rest. "You are the keeper. You cannot escape the words." He clenched his fists, the ink crawling up his arms, pulling him down. He couldn't let it pull him back into the pages. He had to fight. He glanced at Claire one more time, his heart breaking for her, for what she had become. The girl he had known, the girl he had tried to save, was lost. And now so was he. A single line of text appeared on the journal's final page. "The keeper will write, and the keeper will remain." Elliot's breath came in ragged gasps as the ink crawled up his arms, biting into his skin like burning, liquid chains. Every inch of him seemed to bleed into the story, a part of the page, a part of the ink. He could feel it, the binding power of the words, the sense that he was no longer just a person, but a creation, a character. He stumbled backward, trying to shake off the inky tendrils that now gripped him tightly. But the words on the pages didn't let go. You cannot fight the story. The figure's voice echoed all around him, its shadow stretching like a nightmare reaching toward him. Elliot's pulse thudded in his ears as he turned to Claire once again, still standing as a hollow vessel for the ink. She was no longer Claire. She was just another reflection, a part of the story. A tool. His hands tightened into fists. There was no escape, or was there? What if he could rewrite himself again? What if he could tear apart the rules, break them from the inside? He couldn't go back to the way it was. He couldn't accept being the keeper. He glanced at the journal in Claire's hands, the ink slowly bleeding into more lines, more sentences. The words weren't just words now. They were commands, moving through the pages with the force of some dark power. He reached for it, his fingers brushing against the paper. For a split second, the ink paused, as though waiting for him to make the choice. The air around him became hollow, like the calm before the storm. His throat was tight, but he spoke the words anyway, no longer in fear, but with defiance. I refuse to be the keeper. The figure's face twisted in an expression of amusement, its shadow crawling closer. You cannot refuse, it hissed. You have already written your fate. But Elliot didn't back down. He wasn't the same person he had been when he first arrived in the library. He had been changed by the ink, by the story. And if it could change him, then he could change it. He looked down at the journal. The words still bled from the pages, and he knew now, in the deepest part of him, that he could make one final choice. If the ink could create, then it could also destroy. Elliot snatched the journal from Claire's hands, his fingers closing around the pages before the ink could stop him. He pressed the quill to the paper with a sickening certainty, like the weight of destiny itself. I'm no longer the keeper, he wrote. Twist, writhing against him as though the ink itself had a mind. But Elliot didn't stop. He wrote again. This story ends now. The ink screamed, a horrible, gnashing sound like the ripping of something alive. The walls of the library cracked. The bookshelves splintered. The air thickened, swirling around him in a violent storm of ink. And as Elliot pressed the quill harder into the page, the ink exploded, bursting outward like a dark sun. The void consumed everything. Claire, her hollow eyes, vanished into the ink. The library, its endless shelves, disintegrated into nothingness. The figure, that dark presence that had haunted them, let out a final scream, its form shattering as the ink collapsed upon itself. And then, silence. Elliot collapsed to his knees, the journal slipping from his hands. He was back, somewhere else. The world was still, and in the distance, the faint hum of traffic, the soft rustling of trees in the wind, reminded him that, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was free. The ink had been destroyed. The library, the cycle was all gone. Or was it? Elliot looked around, his breath ragged, unsure of what had truly ended. Had he really escaped? Or was he just waiting for the ink to claim him again? And then, in the quiet of the empty street, he felt it. The weight of something familiar, a presence watching him from the corner of his mind. The ink wasn't gone. Not entirely. It was still inside him. A whisper, a faint murmur echoed through his mind. The keeper always returns. Elliot stood, taking a step forward. He had ended the story, but maybe the story was never really finished. Elliot's heart thudded in his chest, the lingering echo of the ink's whispers gnawing at his mind. He looked down at his hands, searching for any remnants of the darkness that had consumed him, but they were clean, normal, just as they should be. Yet, the feeling didn't leave. The feeling that something was waiting. Something that had always been there, just beneath the surface, like a shadow lurking at the edge of the light. The keeper always returns. The words were etched into his mind, repeating over and over like a prayer he couldn't escape. No matter how far he ran, how deep he buried it, the ink was still there. He had destroyed the library, the journal, the figure, but had he destroyed the story? He closed his eyes, fighting the panic rising in his chest. He had to be free. He had to be. But as he exhaled, a faint rustling broke the silence. The wind had shifted, blowing through the empty street, but it wasn't the wind he heard. It was something else, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustling of pages. Elliot froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he turned toward the sound. It came from the alleyway on the far side of the street. A shadow seemed to flicker just beyond the corner, a figure standing motionless against the wall. His pulse quickened. No, he couldn't have. He couldn't have been followed. The shadow stepped forward, revealing a tattered book in its hand, its cover dark and worn, almost familiar. His heart sank. It was the same book, the same cursed journal. But this time, it wasn't in his hands. It was in someone else's. The figure raised its head, revealing a mask of ink-black eyes, just like Claire's. The figure's voice, soft and hollow, reached him before it spoke. The story never ends, Elliot. He couldn't breathe. The figure stepped forward, its presence overwhelming, its gaze pulling at him. It wasn't just one person. It wasn't just Claire anymore. It was a new keeper, a new vessel for the ink, a new beginning. Elliot's mind raced. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let someone else fall into the same trap. The same endless, eternal loop of ink and words. He had broken the cycle once, hadn't he? But if the story had taught him anything, it was that there were always more pages. He took a step back. "I won't let you do this," he said, his voice hoarse but determined. The figure tilted its head, the ink swirling beneath its skin like an unsettling sea. "You think you can stop it?" Elliot didn't answer. He was already running. The air around him shifted, as though the world itself was breathing in sync with him. He could feel the pull of the ink behind him, the story chasing him, the words writing themselves into the very fabric of the world around him. But he couldn't outrun it. He couldn't escape the inevitable. And just as he reached the end of the alley, he found himself facing an open door. A door he didn't remember seeing before. A door that seemed to be waiting for him. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the knob. Was it a trap? Was it another way the ink had trapped him, another piece of the story he couldn't escape? Or was it the exit, the chance to break free, to erase it once and for all? He could hear the footsteps behind him, the shadow growing closer. Without thinking, Elliot swung open the door. And before him lay a room, familiar but distorted, like the library, but it wasn't the library. It was a new space, a space that felt like the edge of reality itself. A place between stories. In the center of the room was an empty chair, and before it, a blank page. Elliot stepped forward, his heart racing. His mind screamed for him to turn back, but there was nowhere else to go. He had no choice. He picked up his quill, and placed the tip to the page. "I'm no longer the keeper." The words bled onto the page, but something shifted in the air. The ink, though it dripped, didn't quite feel like the same ink as before. This was a new story, a different kind of story. As the words continued to spill out, the room began to change, its edges fraying, twisting, like the story was being rewritten in real time, bending around him. And for the first time, he felt in control. The keeper is free. The ink turned into a wave, engulfing the page, the quill, the chair, and him. The room disintegrated, becoming nothing but ink and light, the words swirling around him. The figure, the shadow in the alley, the library, the endless cycle, all of it was fading. And for a moment, Elliot could swear he saw a new beginning, a blank page in front of him, waiting for the next story to be written. He had finally broken free. For real this time. The ink swirled around him, a blur of blackness and light, shifting like the fabric of a dream. The world he had known was disintegrating, fading into oblivion. But there was something strangely peaceful about it. As the library, the figure, and the curse crumbled away, Elliot felt his body becoming weightless, as though he were being pulled into something much larger than himself. It felt like freedom, but there was a nagging sensation, a feeling that, even though everything around him had vanished, something else remained. The blank page before him was a void, a nothingness, but in that nothingness, there was a strange sense of presence. It wasn't just a page. It was a choice. He reached out, fingers trembling, and touched it. The moment he did, a spark of energy shot through him, as though he had activated something buried deep within the very core of reality. And then a sound, a soft, faint sound like a book opening. The page rippled, like the surface of water disturbed by an unseen hand. The edges began to blur, and new words appeared on the page, as though they had always been there. waiting for him to uncover them. The keeper's choice is never final. Elliot stepped back, his heart racing. It was happening again. The ink was calling to him. But this time, it wasn't a voice or a force. It was the page itself pulling him in. He could feel the familiar warmth of the ink, the familiar weight of the quill in his hand, and he realized, with a cold clarity, that the cycle had never been fully broken. The story wasn't over. He hadn't erased the ink. He hadn't destroyed the curse. He had simply moved it. The quill began to write on its own, as if compelled by a force greater than himself. The words on the page flowed like a river, unstoppable and inevitable. The keeper will return to the page, and the story will be rewritten. Elliot wanted to scream, to throw the quill away, to end it. But there was no escaping it now. The ink had woven itself into the very fabric of his existence, and there was no running from it. He looked around at the swirling void. The world around him was a blank canvas, a space waiting to be filled. The ink, the words, the story, it had all been reborn. The ink wasn't his enemy. The story was. But what if he could rewrite it again? What if this time he could choose? Elliot grabbed the quill, his hand steady now. He wasn't going to let the story take him again. Not this time. He dipped the quill into the ink, and the page began to shift, as though it was reacting to his intentions. He wrote a single line. The keeper chooses to end the story. The moment he wrote it, the air around him shuddered. The page glowed, the words glowing brightly, almost alive, as if they had broken free of the confines of the paper. He could feel the very fabric of reality tremble beneath him. But then something shifted again. A whisper. The story was alive, yes, but it was also old. Older than him, older than any of them. And as he wrote, the ink began to spill beyond the page. It crept up his arms, swirling, like it had a mind of its own, pushing him back. The words on the page began to twist, the letters shifting, rewriting themselves as if they knew what was about to happen. It was a paradox, a loop. Elliot couldn't stop. No matter how hard he tried, the story had already begun to reclaim him. He could feel his body changing, as though the ink itself were infusing him once again. And as the words swirled around him, he realized something. He was never meant to escape. The keeper was never meant to be free. He was part of the story. The ink had always been a part of him, and no matter what he wrote, no matter what he chose, the story would never be over. He had simply been chosen to write it. And so, the cycle continued. The page flipped, revealing a new line. The keeper's story is never finished. The ink is eternal. Elliot stood there, staring at the page, a quiet acceptance settling over him. The ink had always been inside him. The keeper was always bound to the page. And so, as the ink flowed, he took up the quill once more. For there was always a story, and he too was part of it. Elliot stood still, the ink swirling around him, clinging to his skin like a second layer. His mind felt foggy, as though he were standing at the edge of a precipice, staring into an endless abyss. The words on the page glowed, pulsing with a life of their own, and he couldn't look away. This was it, the end. But no, not the end, the beginning. The quill trembled in his hand as it hovered over the page. It felt like a strange weight, both a burden and a gift. A piece of something far larger than he was. Far larger than anyone could ever understand. He thought of Claire, of the others who had been lost in this story. Were they still trapped? Was he the only one who had been given a glimpse of the truth? Or had they all been taken, part of the ink, part of the story now? He remembered the figure, the shadow that had stalked him, the force that had controlled him, and he realized something. The figure wasn't just an antagonist. The figure wasn't an enemy. It was the story. The ink had no voice without someone to write it. The keeper had always been the one to control it. And though he had tried to break free, the ink always returned. Because it was eternal. And now, here he stood at the center of it all. The ink had taken root inside him, and he felt it. The power of the story, of the words that could shape reality itself. Was this freedom? Or was this just the next chapter? His thoughts were interrupted by a low ripple in the air, a soft echo that vibrated in his bones. The world around him shuddered, as if reacting to his uncertainty. And then, through the ink and the glow of the page, something began to form. A figure, a shadow at first, but then it became more distinct. A person, or something like one, standing just beyond the edge of the room. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The figure took a step forward, and the ink seemed to shift around it like liquid cloth. As it emerged fully from the shadows, he saw its face, the same face. It was Claire. Her eyes were still dark, still swallowed by ink. But there was something else there now, a glimmer of recognition in her gaze, as if she had been waiting for him. Claire, Elliot whispered, his voice raw, hoarse from the weight of everything that had happened. Claire's lips parted, but the voice that came from her mouth was not hers. The story calls to you, Elliot. The voice was deep, layered with the sound of many voices speaking as one. It wasn't just Claire anymore. It was the story speaking through her. The words that had shaped them both. Elliot stepped back, panic rising. No, this isn't right. This isn't you. Claire, or whatever she had become, tilted her head. No, Elliot, it is you. We are part of the same story now. The air around them began to shift again, the ink swirling into more patterns, more lines, more words. And as it did, a vast space began to unfold around them, an infinite library, stretching endlessly in every direction. It was the library again, but it was different now. Alive. Elliot's heart hammered his chest as he realized what was happening. The library wasn't just a place. It was a realm, a place where all stories lived, stories that had been written, rewritten, and reclaimed. He wasn't just a part of the story anymore. He was now the story, a living chapter in an endless book of infinite pages. We are the ink now. Elliot, Claire's voice whispered. We are eternal. Elliot felt the quill in his hand again. It pulsed with the power of 1,000 stories, 1,000 voices. The ink was no longer just a force. It was alive. It had always been. And he understood now. The cycle was unbroken. The keeper would always return, not because he had to, but because it was in his blood, in his soul. The ink needed him just as it needed Claire. He wasn't trapped in the story. He was the story. The ink never ends, he whispered to himself, the weight of the realization sinking in. The keeper will never be free. A new page appeared before him. This one was blank, waiting to be written, waiting for a new chapter. Write it. The words came, but this time, they didn't feel like a command. They felt like a choice. Elliot stared at the page, at the quill, at Claire standing before him, both a part of him, and yet something else. The ink, the words, the story, it was all alive. And he had a choice. Would he write his own fate? Or would the story write him again? Elliot's fingers trembled as they hovered over the page. One final line, one last chance to write. And then, with a steady hand, he wrote, The keeper has returned, but this time the story is free. As the ink soaked into the page, the room, the library began to shift. It twisted, folding in on itself, the ink fading into the ether, and the words disappeared. For the first time, there was nothing left but the blank page. The ink was no longer eternal. The keeper was no longer bound to the story. The cycle had been broken. The story was finally over. The stillness was overwhelming. Elliot stood in the void, his heart thumping with the weight of what he had just done. The library was gone. The ink was no longer swirling around him. The quill, his steady companion for so long, had dissolved into the ether. For the first time, he felt a complete absence, a silence so profound it seemed to stretch on forever, deeper than the ink, darker than the void. Had he truly broken the cycle? As the blank page hovered before him, Elliot's breath came in shallow gasps. The words had faded, but there was a strange sense of completion in the air, like a piece of music finally coming to a quiet stop, as if the last note had been played and the world was waiting for something that would never come. He looked around, and the empty space seemed to stretch in every direction, an endless abyss of nothingness. It felt like standing on the edge of everything and nothing. But there was no escape, no running. He was alone. And yet, as he gazed into the darkness, something began to shift. A distant whisper, a gentle sound barely audible but present. The echo of something far off, like a forgotten memory stirring. At first, Elliot thought it was his mind playing tricks on him. But then, the whisper came again, clearer this time. The story is not finished. Elliot's breath caught. The voice wasn't his. It wasn't Claire's. It wasn't even a voice he recognized. It was new. It was otherworldly, soft and flowing, like a whispering breeze passing through the cracks of reality itself. He took a tentative step forward, his body trembling with uncertainty. The voice was calling to him, pulling him, beckoning him toward the center of the void. No, Elliot muttered to himself, shaking his head. I broke it. It's over. The ink is gone. The story is gone. It has to be. But the voice persisted, now louder, as though the very fabric of this empty space was speaking to him. It is never truly gone, Elliot. The story only waits for the next writer. Elliot's mind raced. He could feel the cold hand of fear creeping up his spine as the words sank into him. What did it mean? Was it possible that the story could never end? That he was bound to it forever? As he thought about it, the void around him seemed to warp, to shift once more. In the distance, a light began to glow faintly, an illumination that flickered and pulsed like the heartbeat of something alive. And then, a figure emerged from the light. It was familiar but distorted. Elliot's blood ran cold as he recognized the figure. The same shadowed silhouette that had once haunted him. The figure that had led him to the ink. The one who had always been present, watching from the edges of the story. But now, the figure had form. It was cloaked in a deep, flowing black robe, its face concealed beneath a hood. Elliot felt his legs weaken, his thoughts spiraling as the figure stepped closer. It was no longer just a presence. It was something real, something that had always existed, but had never been seen. You cannot escape the story, Elliot. The voice, now unmistakably male, was low and echoing, carrying the weight of an ancient presence. Elliot's mind screamed, and yet he was paralyzed by the sheer power of it. The figure raised a hand, and as it did, the ink began to reappear, just a trickle at first, then a flood. The swirling darkness returned, like a black tide washing over the space, riding itself into existence once again. Elliot felt the pull of it, the same pull that had consumed him before. His hand twitched, instinctively reaching for a quill that was no longer there. The figure spoke again, and the word were laced with both promise and threat. Every story has an end, but every end brings a new beginning. The ink has no choice but to be written. The keeper is always needed. Elliot's voice cracked as he fought to speak. No, I broke the cycle. I stopped the ink. I ended it. The figure tilted its head. You think you ended it? You only paused it. The story does not end until it is forgotten, and the ink can never be forgotten. It will always find a way back. Elliot took a step back, dread watching over him. I didn't choose this. I don't want to be the keeper anymore. I can't be. The figure took another step toward him. The light around it grew brighter, its presence overpowering. You already are. You always were. You were chosen for the story, Elliot. You can never escape it. Elliot's chest tightened, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse under the weight of those words. But then, as the ink began to swirl again, shaping itself into words, forming letters, crafting a story, Elliot realized something. He might have been chosen, but he still had the power. He wasn't just a keeper. He wasn't just a pawn in the ink's game. He was a writer, and writers had the power to choose their endings. With renewed strength, Elliot reached out and grabbed the swirling ink. He felt it pulse in his hands, alive with possibilities. The ink didn't control him. It never had. He had to write his ending. A final choice. He grasped the quill, even as the figure moved closer, its voice rising in urgency. Don't. But it was too late. Elliot raised the quill and, with one final stroke, he wrote the only thing that could set him free. The story ends here. The ink stood still for a moment, frozen on the page Elliot had written. The quill was held aloft in his trembling hand, the weight of the words pressing down on him. He had done it. He had written his final line, his escape from the unending cycle. The ink ceased to swirl. The figure before him paused. The void was eerily silent. The whispers had stopped. The weight of it all began to lift, as if the entire universe had taken a breath and held it, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest, the sound loud in the stillness, a reminder that he was alive, that he was free. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe it. He had broken the cycle. The figure before him, still cloaked in shadow, stepped back. It hesitated, staring at the final words on the page, the last words. The story ends here. It lingered for a moment longer, as if the universe itself had to accept that truth. And then, with a final, heavy sigh, the figure spoke, but this time the voice held no command, no dominance. You think it ends, Elliot? But stories, they never truly end. Not really. The figure lowered its hood, revealing a face, one that was not Claire's, but something that resembled her, something familiar. And yet, as the figure's eyes locked with his, Elliot felt an inexplicable emptiness, like something vital had been stripped away. You have chosen an ending, it said softly. But every ending creates a space, a void. And in that void, something new will always grow. Elliot's chest tightened. The ink, the words, they pulsed with a strange rhythm. And even though the figure's presence was fading, the thought lingered. What happens when a story ends and the page is left blank? With that question unanswered, the figure simply vanished, dissolving into the surrounding darkness, leaving behind only the faintest trace of its presence. The page before Elliot shimmered, still glowing with the words he had written. But now those words began to fade, just as if the ink had been swallowed by the darkness itself. The quill in his hand, once a source of overwhelming power, now felt like a hollow tool. It slipped from his fingers, falling into the black void beneath him. Elliot stood alone, the blankness around him an unsettling reminder that everything had changed. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, staring at the empty space, the fading remnants of his final choice. And then there was a sound. A faint crackle, a soft hiss, like the sound of paper being torn from its spine. Elliot turned, and from the distance, he saw it, a flicker of light. A page appearing out of nowhere. It fluttered in the dark air, glowing with an eerie brightness. His pulse quickened. Was it another story? With slow, hesitant steps, he moved toward the page. His heart thudded, his mind racing with a mixture of dread and curiosity. He reached out, and the moment his fingers brushed against the paper, the words began to form, slow and deliberate. The story will always find its way back. The ink swirled, a chaotic rush of blackness that consumed the page once more. Elliot felt a sharp tug, a familiar pull. He backed away, but it was no use. The ink clung to him, wrapping around his limbs, crawling beneath his skin, as if the very essence of the story had been reawakened. The quill appeared in his hand once more, as though it had never left. The words began to write themselves. Elliot could barely keep up, his mind screaming in confusion as the ink spread across the page. Each word, each letter etched with an almost inexorable will of its own. The keeper cannot escape the story. It was happening again. He could feel it, the undeniable truth. The words had already begun, and no matter what he wrote, they would write him. The ink, the story, was never truly gone. Elliot staggered back, trying to tear himself free from the pull, but the page spread. The ink covered the floor, creeping toward him, as if the story was reclaiming him. He could hear the whisper again, faint but unmistakable. You are the story. You cannot run from what you are. He stumbled backward, falling to his knees as the ink encircled him, as the pages began to stack themselves around him, page after page. It felt like a crushing weight. The blackness of the ink pressed against his chest, suffocating him. His breath was shallow, panicked. He tried to fight it, tried to reject it. But deep down, a quiet realization settled within him. This was who he was. The ink had never just been a curse or a force. It had been part of him all along. The story would never end, not for him, because the story was his to write. He couldn't run from it anymore. But maybe, just maybe, he could write it differently this time. Elliot raised the quill once again, and with trembling hands, he began to rewrite. The keeper chooses his own ending. The ink stilled for a moment, as if considering the choice. Then, as though understanding his intent, it began to fade into the background, leaving behind a vast, empty space, a new page, untouched. For the first time, Elliot allowed himself to breathe. He had written the end, but not for the story. For himself. And for the first time, he believed it. Elliot's fingers rested on the final line he had written, the quill still trembling in his grasp. The ink had faded away, leaving behind nothing but a blank page. It was pure, untouched, and for the first time, it felt like the space around him was truly empty. The suffocating weight of the ink, the pull of the story, it had all vanished. The void had opened up before him, but this time, it was different. The emptiness didn't feel like a threat. It didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a possibility. Elliot took a deep breath, the silence around him strangely comforting. He had been a part of something much larger than himself for so long. The ink, the story, the keeper. It had all seemed like a force that he could never escape. But now, in this blank space, it felt like there was no force, no inevitability. There was only choice. The ink had no power over him anymore. The quill felt lighter in his hand, no longer a heavy tool of creation and destruction. It was simply a tool, a choice, an option. But there was still something unsettling about the silence. The whispering voices, the ink swirling around him, all of it was gone, and in its place was only stillness. No stories, no characters, no events unfolding. Just a vast, infinite emptiness that stretched endlessly in every direction. And then, like a forgotten memory, the words came again. A story cannot be left untold. Elliot's heart skipped. He wasn't alone. He could feel something in the air around him, an imprint, a presence that hadn't been there before. He wasn't sure if it was his mind playing tricks or something deeper, but he knew that the words had come from somewhere. Not the page, not the ink, but from the very space he was in. The emptiness, the blankness, it was alive, still waiting for something to take shape. The thought came to him like a flash of clarity. If the story was not told, it would never end. It would linger forever in this empty space, waiting for someone to write it. His mind began to race. Was it possible that he had misunderstood everything? Could it be that the story never truly ended, but only paused? That the ink, the words, they were part of something much larger, something cyclical, a force that could never truly be stopped? No, he couldn't let himself fall into that trap again. He was not the keeper anymore. He was no longer bound to the ink. He had chosen to end it. And yet, the void around him seemed to pulse, as though it were waiting for him to begin once more. He looked at the blank page in his hands. The weight of the quill felt different now, lighter, freer. He could write again if he wanted to. He could create something entirely new, something outside the cycle. He could choose. But what if that was the trap? What if the only reason he felt free was because the ink wanted him to write? Was there truly a way to be free, or was the story simply waiting for him to pick up the pen again? Elliot swallowed, feeling the old pull return, a subtle tug at the edges of his consciousness. Could he resist it? Could he truly walk away from the ink, from the story? A voice, soft but insistent, whispered once more in his mind. The story must be told. Was it his own voice? Was it the voice of the ink? Or was it something else entirely? The blank page in his hands shimmered, the edges beginning to darken as though a story was about to form. Words, lines, letters, they all began to bleed onto the page, slowly, hesitantly at first. Elliot's pulse quickened. It was happening again. The ink was returning, reclaiming him. But this time it was different. He wasn't going to write the story. He wasn't going to create anything. He was going to let the page remain blank. He closed his eyes and held the page firmly in his hands. The weight of the quill and the ink faded away, and for the first time in his life, he allowed the silence to fill him. He didn't have to fight it. He didn't have to fill the void with words, with stories. He could just be. The ink stopped flowing. The page remained still. The space around him grew even quieter. The emptiness, instead of pressing down on him, seemed to open up, stretching outward, expansive, limitless. And then a strange sensation washed over him, a feeling of peace. A release. The tension he hadn't even known he'd been holding, the pressure to constantly create, to constantly write, it all evaporated. For the first time, he was free. The story was not gone. It was just not needed anymore. The ink had no power. The words had no weight. It was all just space, possibility, choice. Elliot took one last look at the blank page. He could write if he wanted to, but for now, the story didn't need him. He didn't need to fill it with anything. He let go of the quill. He let the page remain untouched. And in that moment, he knew that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is leave the page blank. Elliot let the quill fall to the ground, the soft thud it made when it landed a final punctuation in the quiet of the void. He had made his choice. He was done with stories, done with ink, with words, with endless cycles that seemed to tie him to something far beyond his control. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight on his chest had lifted. But as the quills settled into the dark abyss below him, something shifted. It was subtle at first. The edges of the blank page began to shimmer again, a faint glimmer of movement in the stillness. The void, which had felt so complete moments ago, seemed to hold something now. A pull, an energy, like a faint pulse beneath the surface. Elliot's chest tightened, and he instinctively took a step back, eyes fixed on the page. It was like watching the ripples of water after a stone had been thrown into a lake. The stillness was being disturbed, but there was no visible source, nothing to point to as the cause. "What is this?" Elliot whispered to himself, his voice barely audible in the silence. And then it came again, the whisper. It was low, barely a breath, but it was unmistakable. "You cannot leave." Elliot's heart skipped, and his eyes widened. He hadn't imagined it. The voice was real. It felt familiar, yet distant, as if it came from deep inside the space itself. The very fabric of the void seemed to be speaking to him, as though it had its own consciousness. He shook his head. No, he had already broken free. The ink, the story, it was all over. He had chosen to leave. The void was nothing but empty space, and he was no longer part of it. But the page in front of him began to pulse once more. Dark tendrils of ink snaked from its corners, creeping outward like fingers, curling into the void. The words that had once been so still and quiet began to move again. The letters were not forming into sentences, not yet, but they were there alive, shifting in ways that felt wrong. He reached out instinctively, his hand hovering over the page, unsure. He could feel something urging him, calling to him. It wasn't a demand this time. It was more like a question, a possibility. And then the words began to form. Unseen, unbidden. The page was writing itself. You thought you could escape the story. The ink bled across the page in dark, jagged lines. The words didn't make sense at first, like a dream barely remembered, but Elliot felt their weight press against him. He could feel the presence, the story, growing again. The same sense of inevitability, of something beyond him that he couldn't control. He stepped back again, his breathing shallow. The voice was back. He tried to close his mind, to force the ink to stop, but the harder he tried, the more it writhed. The words were coming for him. The page shimmered, and then it was as if the ink opened up, a swirl, a vortex of dark lines, pulling him in. The story was being reborn right before him, and no matter how hard he struggled to fight it, the words kept drawing closer. There is no escape, Elliot. His hand reached out once more. He felt like he was being sucked into the ink, his fingers trembling as the blackness surrounded him. It was pulling him in, not physically, but mentally, emotionally. He could feel his own will slipping away, the sense of freedom slipping through his fingers. The story was still there. The ink had never truly gone. You are the story. The words echoed around him, reverberating like 1,000 voices speaking from the same mouth. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the screaming noise that surrounded him, but it only grew louder. The presence of the void, the story, it was consuming him again like it always had, like it always would. He had been so sure that leaving the ink behind was the right choice, but the truth was undeniable now. The story never leaves. It cannot. It becomes you. Elliot's thoughts began to blur. The distinction between him and the story, between his mind and the ink, began to fade until he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Was he writing the story? Or was the story writing him? His breath came faster. The ink spun around him, faster like a whirlpool, drawing him deeper into its center. He reached out once more, but it wasn't a conscious decision. It wasn't his choice. It wasn't even a thought. It was instinct. The page, the ink, it had already written him. And as the words took form in the blackness, Elliot couldn't help but read them. The story continues. The end was not an option. Elliot's mind spun. The ink surrounded him, pulling him into its dark embrace, suffocating him with its presence. The words on the page were no longer just symbols. They were alive, wrapping around him like a cocoon. He could feel them deep within, twisting his thoughts, rewriting his very being. There was no escape, no space to breathe, no sense of who he was anymore. "You are the keeper," the voice whispered again. But this time it was not a statement. It was a command. Elliot's eyes snapped open, but he saw nothing but black. The ink had consumed the world around him, and the page, his page, was everywhere. It wasn't just an object, it was his existence, his reality. The words carved themselves into the void, and they didn't just describe his world, they formed it. The edges of the page shimmered as more ink began to spill across the surface, filling the empty space with relentless force. Elliot felt himself pulled deeper into the words, his consciousness fading with every stroke of the quill, every syllable written into the endless abyss. The ink was no longer just an extension of him, it was everything. The ink had always been in control. It had always been the architect of this world. And Elliot, despite his best efforts, had always been a part of it. The whispers grew louder. He could feel them crawling through his thoughts, their presence overwhelming. He was the story, and the story would never let him go. "You belong to the ink," the voice crooned, now unmistakably familiar. It was not a force outside of him. It was him. He was the ink. Elliot gasped. His breath was ragged, shallow. There was nothing left, no space to think, no time to breathe. He was caught between the world of ink and the world of flesh. His mind burned with the impossibility of the situation. But deep down, as the ink wrapped tighter around him, as the words filled every corner of his mind, a strange peace settled within him. The words had always defined him. The ink had always been him. What else was there? What else could he be but the story? And then, as if he were falling into a trance, something unexpected happened. The ink paused. The words stopped flowing. Elliot blinked, disoriented. It was as if the whole world had frozen in time. For a brief moment, he could feel something else, nothingness. A strange, empty stillness surrounded him, and he stood at the precipice of a new reality. The page was still before him, but it was different now. The ink seemed to recede, pulling back into the deep shadows that surrounded him, leaving only a blank space. For the first time since the story had started, Elliot was alone. There were no voices, no whispers, no ink pulling at him, no words to write. It was simply him. The silence pressed against his eardrums, deafening in its stillness. And yet, in that moment, something sparked within him. An idea, a vision. What if he didn't have to follow the same path? What if he could choose a new story? He had rewritten his fate once before. But now, the page was blank. The quill was still in his hand. This moment, this silence, was an opportunity. What if he could be more than just a part of the story? A deep breath, tentative and filled with uncertainty, escaped his lips. His eyes flickered to the blank page before him. His fingers gripped the quill. He wasn't the keeper anymore. He wasn't bound to the ink. He wasn't the one who had to write the story. He was the author. The ink started to stir again, but this time, it felt different. He had control now. With every word that formed, every sentence he wrote, he felt himself pulling away from the cycle, from the ink. It was as though the very essence of the story was being rewritten, not just on the page, but in him. The words were his to command now. He wasn't trapped in the cycle. He was creating it. The story is mine to shape. The ink slowed, hesitant, as though it recognized the shift in power. But Elliot could feel it now. The ink was no longer a force that dominated him. It was a tool. It was his tool. The quill danced across the page, and Elliot felt the weight of the story shifting beneath his hand. The words flowed effortlessly, but they were no longer written by the story itself. They were his. He had taken control. The page filled, not with demands or inevitable outcomes, but with possibilities. The ink wrapped around his words, growing, evolving, shifting into something new. The story was still there, but now, it was something Elliot had created. He was the one who shaped it. He was no longer just a character. He was the author. The void around him began to dissipate, the shadows receding into the distance, leaving behind a blank canvas. The ink swirled into shapes, colors, something that felt alive, something that was his to define. The page before him stretched out infinitely, and within it, Elliot began to write not just for himself, but for everything. For the first time, he wasn't bound by the story. The story was bound by him. And the words that filled the page were not just sentences. They were worlds. They were choices. They were the very essence of everything he could be. This is my story now. The last line of the page faded into existence, glowing with new meaning. The story had always been endless, always repeating. But now, Ellie understood something. The ink, the words, they could be both the past and the future. They could be life and death. It was his choice. And this story was only just beginning. Elliot's hand hovered above the page, the quill trembling in his grasp. The words that he had written, the story that he had started to shape, began to glow with a strange intensity. The page stretched out endlessly before him, rippling like a vast ocean of ink, a world he could mold with a single stroke. The sense of power, of control, was overwhelming. But even as the words flowed freely from his hand, a nagging feeling tugged at him. What was he really creating? Was this freedom, or was it simply another version of the same cycle that had trapped him before? He could feel it deep within him, the presence that had been with him all along. The ink was still alive, still waiting to pull him back into its embrace. The whispers, the voices, the urges, they hadn't truly gone away. They had only quieted, hidden beneath the surface. Elliot paused, his fingers hovering over the page. The story was his to shape, but what if, just what if, the ink was still guiding him? What if the story was always meant to be written, no matter who held the quill? Do you truly think you can escape? The voice, soft but persistent, reverberated in his mind. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a truth. He clenched his jaw, feeling the ink pulse beneath his skin. There was still something inevitable about the words. They moved through him. They defined him. No matter how hard he tried to push it away, the ink was a part of him. The page before him continued to shimmer, its surface now alive with possibility. He could feel the power of creation surging within him, but there was a weight to it, a heaviness that made his hand shake. For the first time, he questioned his right to write. What would happen if he stopped? What would happen if the ink faded into nothingness, leaving him with an empty page? Would the story remain, trapped within the lines of ink, or would the very fabric of his existence disappear with it? The words started to form again, swirling on the page. He wasn't writing them. He wasn't even aware of them. They were coming from somewhere else, somewhere deep inside him, from the core of the ink itself. The story never ends. His heart raced. The words were too familiar. He had written them once, hadn't he? Hadn't he? No, this couldn't be happening. He had broken free. He had chosen to walk away from the ink, to leave the page blank. The blankness had been the answer, hadn't it? But here they were, the words, the ink, the story, always lurking, always waiting to be written. The cycle is eternal. You cannot escape. The voice was louder now, more insistent. It was no longer a whisper, but a command. The ink began to swirl faster, more frantically. The page seemed to ripple and distort, like a dark vortex pulling at the edges of his mind. Elliot slammed his fist onto the table, his breath ragged. He couldn't keep running from it. But could he rewrite it? Could he change the ink itself, erase the cycle? The quill shook in his hand as he gripped it tighter, his resolve hardening. No, he wouldn't let the ink win. He wouldn't let the story claim him again. He closed his eyes, focusing all his will into the quill. The ink responded, swirling at his command, waiting for him to choose the next line, the next chapter. And then, the realization hit him. He could write his own ending. The words had always felt like a trap, like a cage, but what if, just what if, he could turn the story on its head? What if the ink could be more than just a force that defined him? What if it could be his tool, his way to shape the world? The void began to close in around him, the ink creeping closer. But this time, Elliot didn't recoil. This time, he embraced it. He could feel the stories swirling, the potential of every word, every line, every possibility. The story could go on forever, but this time, he would write it his way. With a deep breath, he pressed the quill to the page. The story begins again. But this time, it was different. The ink, once dark and oppressive, shifted. It shimmered, glowing with an almost soft light. The page filled with new words, words he had never written before, words that didn't belong to the old story. This is my creation. Elliot's pulse quickened as the ink spread, forming something entirely new. The page blossomed with life, creating characters, landscapes, entire worlds, not bound by the ink cycle, but shaped by his hand. The story was his, not a repetition of past mistakes, but a world built from scratch. The whispers, the voices, the ink, they were still there, but now they were just pieces of the story. They were no longer his masters. They were tools, tools that he had control over. Elliot felt a deep sense of peace. He was no longer just a character caught in a never-ending narrative. He was the author of his own fate, the creator of worlds. He let go of the quill, standing up from the table. The page continued to unfold before him, revealing endless possibilities. He had crossed the line. He had broken the cycle. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elliot understood. He was free. Elliot stood before the blank page, watching it unfold beneath his fingertips. The ink had changed, become something that felt more like a companion than a force of control. It shimmered with new possibilities, colors that hadn't existed before, possibilities, not constraints. But with this newfound freedom came an undeniable weight. He could create anything. He could form entire worlds, characters, universes. He could breathe life into things that had never existed, erase parts of the past he wished to forget, and write a future that was all his own. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized, what if the ink was just a reflection of him? What if the stories he created weren't truly his at all, but simply extensions of his own desires, fears, and weaknesses? What if the cycle of creation wasn't something he could break? Elliot's fingers tightened on the quill. His thoughts spun as he stared at the page, the ink swirling beneath his touch. What happens when the author becomes the story? The question slipped from his lips before he could stop it. The words trembled in the air, fading almost as soon as they were spoken, but the weight of them lingered. A new sensation washed over him, something akin to the same familiarity he had felt in the beginning, when the ink first took root. The ink was no longer a chaotic force. Now it felt more like a vast ocean, deep, endless, waiting to be navigated. Could he steer it? Could he control the tides? He clenched his jaw, the same question gnawing at him. What if he couldn't? Suddenly, a strange silence descended upon the space around him. The ink stopped moving, and the world held its breath. His mind raced, scrambling to understand what was happening. And then, like a whisper breaking through the stillness, a voice spoke. But this time, it wasn't from the page. It came from within him. You think you can break free, but you were always meant to be here. Elliot froze. The voice was his own, but not. It was beneath him. It was the part of him that he had never fully understood, the part that had always been tied to the ink, to the page, to the story itself. You are the keeper, the writer, the story, and this will never change. His breath caught in his throat. The weight of the words hit him like a wave, crashing against the walls of his mind. He had thought he could escape the ink, but maybe he had never truly wanted to. Maybe he had always been meant to write, to create, to live inside the stories he told. What would happen if he stopped? Would he disappear? Was there even a world outside the page? He took a slow, deliberate step back from the table. The quill dropped from his fingers, clattering softly to the floor. A strange calm washed over him, as though he had finally come to terms with the reality of his existence. The ink wasn't his enemy. It wasn't something to fight against. It was a part of him. And now, for the first time, he understood. He didn't need to fight it. He could shape the ink however he wanted, could write any story. But the truth was, he didn't have to anymore. The ink would always be there. It would always be a part of him, but it didn't define him. He was no longer trapped in the cycle. He could choose. The page shimmered again, but this time, Elliot didn't reach for the quill. He didn't need to. He understood now. The story would keep going, but it wouldn't be defined by him. It would be defined by everything. He closed his eyes, his heart steady, and for the first time in years, the voice inside his head was silent. The ink was no longer a prison. It was a world, and the world, in all its infinite possibilities, was his to experience, whether he wrote it or lived it. Elliot turned away from the table, walking slowly toward the edge of the void. The page continued to shift and change behind him, the ink swirling on its own, alive with new stories, new possibilities. And as he stepped into the darkness, he knew one thing for sure. The story was not over. It had never been over. Elliot stood on the precipice of the void, the endless ink swirling behind him like a living tide, an infinite world of possibilities unfurling like the blankiest of canvases. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt free, truly free. No longer bound to the ink, no longer a prisoner of a never-ending cycle. He simply existed. The silence that had descended on him felt peaceful, like the calm before a storm. He had taken the first step into the unknown, into the uncertainty of the blank page, and yet something still tugged at him. A question, a whisper, a doubt. He wasn't sure if he was still part of the story. Was he still a keeper? Had he truly left the ink behind? Or was it still there, lurking just beneath the surface? The void stretched out before him, and Elliot took a tentative step forward. The air around him felt charged, as though every possibility existed in this moment. Every word, every sentence, it all hovered in the space between his mind and the ink. He glanced back, half expecting to see the page still behind him, but it was gone. The ink had retreated. In its place was an endless expanse of space, one that was completely unwritten, untouched by any story. A ripple of anxiety passed through him, but he pushed it down. There was nothing to fear anymore, nothing but choice. And for the first time, Elliot understood the weight of that choice, how deeply the act of creating could change everything. What would he do next? His heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know. The story, whatever it was, no longer had a path. There was no set course, no predetermined beginning, middle, or end. This was a new world, one without limits. He could feel the weight of it, though. The ink, the page, it hadn't disappeared. It was simply waiting dormant. And as much as he wanted to leave it behind, a part of him wondered, could he live without it? Could he exist in a world of pure, unfiltered possibility? Or had the ink always been the force that grounded him, that gave him meaning? A sudden shift in the air made him freeze. The ink, silent and still moments before, had started to move again. But it was different this time. There was no more pulling, no more force. The ink simply shifted, as if it were now an extension of the world itself. It didn't control him. It responded to him. He took another step forward, watching as the ink began to swirl in intricate patterns at his feet, slowly rising like the tides of an ocean. He could feel the pulse of it, the deep heartbeat of the story that could have been. It was alive, yes, but it was waiting for him to decide. A familiar voice echoed in his mind, a voice that had been with him all along. You were never meant to leave. The words filled him with an eerie sense of comfort. They weren't threatening, nor were they commands. It was more like an old friend offering a truth he had always known but hadn't wanted to admit. Elliot closed his eyes, letting the ink swirl around him. This time, instead of resisting, he embraced it. He could feel it filling the space, the weight of the words, the power of the stories they could create. He could see them now, not just as symbols on a page, but as something far more complex, far more alive. Each word was a potential universe. Each sentence a new life, a new story waiting to unfold. And the more he let the ink wash over him, the more he realized that he had never truly been separate from it. He had always been a part of the cycle. Perhaps it wasn't about escaping. Perhaps it was about understanding. His fingers twitched, an involuntary movement, and the ink responded. It wasn't something he consciously commanded, but rather something that simply happened. A ripple of new stories emerged, swirling like the first lines of an epic novel. He wasn't writing them. He was simply allowing them to exist. For the first time, Elliot felt the ink not as a force that defined him, but as something he could coexist with. The stories weren't his burden. They were his companions. The endless page was not a prison, but a world in constant flux, alive, breathing, and always changing. The realization hit him like a wave. The ink was not just the past or the future. It was the present, constantly evolving, ever expanding. Every stroke of the quill was a choice, yes, but it wasn't about being free from the ink. It was about embracing it, about creating together. Elliot's heart slowed, and for the first time in his existence, he felt at peace. There was no more struggle, no more fight. The ink would always be there, and he would always be part of it. But this time, he wasn't trapped by it. He could write if he wanted. He could live if he wanted. He could simply be. With a deep breath, Elliot stepped forward again, deeper into the ink. The swirling mass enveloped him, but it didn't pull him down. Instead, it flowed around him, becoming a part of him, not as a master, but as a partner. The story wasn't ending. It had never ended. It was always becoming. And as Elliot took his first step into the infinite, he realized that maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Elliot stood at the edge of a new world, the ink swirling around him like the wind, constantly shifting, ever-changing. It was no longer a force that controlled him, but something that coexisted with him. He was not its master, nor was he its servant. He was simply part of it, and it was part of him. As he walked deeper into the ink, it seemed to pull away from him, as if giving him space, allowing him to breathe. The lines of the page were no longer confined to the small corners of a book, but stretched endlessly in all directions. The world of words was expanding, becoming as vast as the imagination itself. The feeling of freedom was intoxicating, but even as the ink flowed like a river around him, a small, nagging thought kept tugging at the back of his mind. Was this truly the freedom he had sought? The ink had never fully disappeared. It had always been there, a part of the world, shaping reality in subtle, invisible ways. It wasn't just ink on a page anymore. It was the pulse of the universe, the lifeblood of creation. Every idea, every thought, every whisper of story was born from it. Elliot paused, watching as new words formed in the air before him, floating like stars in the dark. They weren't his words, not directly, but they felt familiar. They felt like echoes of his own thoughts, his own memories, his own desires. The ink had become something living, breathing, and now it was waiting for him to choose. Was it still a story? Or was it something else entirely? A flicker of doubt crossed his mind. What had he truly escaped from? Was the ink ever truly a prison? Or had it been a canvas? A place where every moment of his existence had been etched, every breath of his life written in real time? Maybe the real question was whether he could live without it. Could he survive in a world without stories? A sudden shift in the air snapped him out of his thoughts. The ink around him began to stir, swirling faster as though reacting to the tension in his mind. He took a step back, unsure of what was happening, but something deep within him urged him to stay still, to let it happen. The swirling ink began to coalesce, forming shapes and figures. They weren't just words anymore, they were images. Figures appeared before him, half-formed but recognizable. Shadows of people, outlines of cities, landscapes that felt like memories. He knew these images. They were his creations, his stories, his worlds. But they were also something more. The ink had become a reflection of everything he had ever thought, every emotion, every desire he had ever harbored. His fears, his regrets, his hopes, they were all here, all swirling together in an endless sea of creation. As the images solidified into something tangible, he realized the truth. He was still part of the story. But it wasn't just his story. It was everyone's story, the collective thread of all creation, all thoughts, all lives, all ideas. The ink wasn't just his to control. It was shared, woven into the fabric of the world. He took another step forward, the ground beneath his feet soft, yet solid. It felt like he was walking on a dream, but each step left a mark in the shifting ink. Each footfall created ripples, patterns that spread out like waves in a pond. He could see them now, others. Figures emerging from the ink, their forms taking shape like reflections in a broken mirror. Each one was different, unique, but all of them were familiar. Some were versions of him. Others were strangers, people he had never met, but they felt like they had always been there, waiting to be noticed. "You are not alone," a voice said, soft but clear. Elliot turned to face the source of the voice, but there was no one there. The figures in the ink were watching him, waiting. "You are the beginning," the voice continued, "but you are also the echo. The ink does not belong to you alone. It is a part of everything, a part of everyone. Every story feeds into the next, and the next, and the next. You're not the end, Elliot. You are the continuation. A chill ran down his spine. The voice. It wasn't just a voice. It was the voice of the ink, the collective consciousness of creation itself, speaking through him, through them all. Elliot felt his heart race as the weight of the words settled over him. This was what he had always been a part of, and what he would always be. The ink, the stories, they were endless, eternal, and shared. Every life, every moment, was a chapter in a book that would never end. "Do you see now?" the voice asked. He nodded slowly. The figures in the ink were more than mere shadows now. They were people, real, breathing people, as real as he was. They were him, and they were not him. They were the stories he had lived, and the stories he had yet to live. They were the reflection of every choice, every possibility. "You are not meant to escape," the voice whispered. "You are meant to create." And in that moment, Ellie understood. The ink was not a prison. It was not a cage. It was the tapestry of existence, woven together by the countless stories of those who had lived and those who would yet live. He was not its keeper, but its partner. The ink wasn't something to control. It was something to experience, to share. He took a deep breath, and for the first time, he felt the weight of creation not as a burden, but as a gift. A gift that stretched on forever. He was not just writing his own story anymore. He was writing everyone's story. He was not the beginning. He was the echo of every voice that had ever been, and every voice that ever would be. And as the ink swirled around him, he let himself be part of it. Let himself be part of the infinite, the endless, the ever-expanding page. Elliot stood in the center of the swirling ink, watching as it continued to evolve and shift around him. The patterns were no longer just chaotic, but began to form clear lines, delicate threads weaving together into intricate designs. It was like standing in the middle of a cosmic loom, each thread representing a different story, a different life. The patterns were alive, vibrant, each thread pulsing with energy. He took another step forward, allowing the ink to touch his skin. It felt different now. Warm, alive, as if it was no longer just something he controlled, but something that understood him. He wasn't the only creator here. He was a part of something far larger, something that stretched out beyond his comprehension. With each step, the threads began to connect to him, curling around his fingers, twining around his arms. They felt familiar, as though they were made just for him. Each thread was a reflection of a moment, a choice, a turning point in time. And as they touched him, he could feel the weight of those decisions, those lives, pressing against his soul. And yet, it wasn't a burden. It was an invitation to embrace everything, every story, every possibility. The ink didn't just contain the past. It held the potential for the future. It was infinite, and in that infinity, Elliot could sense a strange kind of unity. Every decision, every action was connected to another, no matter how distant. He reached out with trembling hands, and as he did, the threads shifted, forming something new. An image took shape before him, something that was entirely unfamiliar and yet entirely his. A small house, nestled at the edge of a dense forest. A lone figure stood in the doorway, gazing out into the unknown. He recognized the figure in an instant. It was him, but not him. This wasn't the Elliot who had spent years trapped by the ink, nor the Elliot who had just discovered the power to reshape reality. This was a new version of himself, a version that had made different choices, lived a different life. His reflection shimmered in the ink as he stared into the house. "You see," the voice from earlier echoed, soft and knowing. "Every story is a thread, Elliot, and every thread can be rewoven. You're not the only version of yourself in this world. There are endless versions, endless possibilities, waiting for you to discover." Elliot swallowed hard. The weight of the voice's words settled deep in his chest. For so long, He had thought that his life was defined by a single path, that he was bound to follow a particular narrative. But now he understood that his life was only one thread in an infinite web. He wasn't just a participant in the story, he was a living part of it, a piece of the ever-growing tapestry. As the figure in the house raised a hand, a new scene began to unfurl. Elliot stepped back as the ink around him transformed into a bustling city street, crowded with people. Each one of them was a version of himself, different, yet somehow the same. Some wore clothes that he recognized from his past. Others wore outfits from futures he had never imagined. Each face was a reflection of a choice he hadn't made, a life he hadn't lived. 1,000 versions of him walked the streets, each moving in their own direction, unaware of the others. But Elliot could see the connections, small, invisible threads linking them all together. Their lives were all intersecting, all woven into a single, infinite network of moments. You can visit them, if you wish, the voice said again. See what could have been. See what still might be. The ink is yours to navigate. The stories are yours to explore. Elliot hesitated. He didn't know how to feel. There was something so tempting about it all. The idea that he could see every version of himself, every possibility, every outcome. But there was also something terrifying about it. To confront every version of himself, to see the choices he had made and the ones he hadn't, was like staring into an endless abyss. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his thoughts. When he opened them again, the city was gone. The ink had shifted once more, revealing something else entirely. It was a field of wide, open space. A place of peace. There were no people here, no paths to follow, no choices to make. Just wide, empty sky and the quiet hum of the ink surrounding him. In the distance, he could see a single figure walking toward him. As it drew closer, Elliot recognized her. Lena. Her face was softer than he remembered, her eyes full of warmth, but there was a sadness there, too. She stopped a few feet away from him, and Elliot could feel the weight of their shared history pressing between them. The things they had never said, the choices they had never made, all hung in the air like unfinished sentences. You found it, haven't you? Lena said, her voice soft but steady. The endless possibilities, the never-ending stories. Elliot didn't know what to say. His heart was racing in his chest, and the words caught in his throat. He had so many questions, so many feelings swirling within him. But for the first time in so long, there was only one thought that stood out above all the others. Why? Lena smiled faintly. Because, Elliot, we are all stories. We're the choices we make, the lives we live, and the paths we choose not to walk. We're the threads that weave together, and the ink that keeps flowing. You were never meant to be just one version of yourself. You were always meant to be many. Elliot let her words sink in. The city, the forest, the house, they were all him. All the lives he could have lived, all the roads he could have taken, all the choices he had made and never made. They were all part of the same infinite tapestry, constantly changing, constantly evolving. He wasn't just a single thread. He was part of a universe of threads, each one connected to another, each one existing in parallel, diverging and converging in infinite patterns. The realization was staggering, and yet it filled him with something deeper than fear. It was acceptance. The ink was not just something to be controlled. It was a part of him, and in its endless flow, there was freedom. The ink around him swirled once more, creating new paths, new possibilities. Elliot took a deep breath, and with one final glance at Lena, he stepped forward. For the first time, he didn't need to know where he was going. He just needed to follow the threads. Elliot felt the weight of the ink shift as he moved forward, stepping further into the infinite landscape of possibilities. The ink no longer felt like a mere substance. It was a living thing, pulsating with life, responding to his every breath, every thought. The landscape around him morphed again, as though the world itself was an unfinished manuscript, each word, each letter still waiting to be written. He could feel the pull of countless stories, tugging at him from every direction. Some were familiar, whispers of choices he had made, or choices he might have made. Others were foreign, like glimpses of lives he could never live, roads he would never walk. And then there were those that were completely blank, pages not yet written, fates not yet decided. For the first time, Elliot realized that the ink was not just a canvas for his past, but a horizon stretching far beyond what he could see. He was standing at the edge of an endless ocean of stories, each wave a new possibility, each ripple a thread that could pull him into a completely new world. A soft rustling sound broke through the quiet, and he turned. Before him stood another figure, more solid than the wisps he had seen before, but still not fully formed. It was a woman. He knew that much, but her face was blurred, her features shifting like smoke. She reached out a hand, and the air around her shimmered, like the very fabric of reality was bending. "You don't have to keep moving," she said, her voice gentle but filled with an otherworldly calm. "You can stop, you know. You can choose to stay here, to simply exist in the stories you have already created." Elliot hesitated, unsure what she meant. "Stay here, in the ink?" The figure nodded, and with the motion, her form solidified slightly, just enough for Elliot to make out the shape of her face, familiar, yet alien. She was someone from his past, someone he had once known, someone he had loved. This world, this ink, is a reflection of everything that has been and everything that could be, she continued. "You don't have to keep searching. You can find peace here, among the pages you've already written." Elliot's heart clenched as the weight of her words settled in. He was tired of endless searching, of chasing after paths that led nowhere, of following a story that never seemed to end. Maybe she was right. Maybe he could find solace in the stories he had already lived, the moments he had already written. But as he stood there, the soft pull of the ink, the beckoning of the infinite stories, lingered in the air, like a whisper he couldn't ignore. There was something deeper at play here, something beyond mere existence, beyond simple peace. "And what if I want to create something more?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper, uncertain but filled with a quiet yearning. "What if I want to write a new story, one that isn't defined by what came before?" The woman's eyes softened, as if she had anticipated the question. "You can. You always could. You're a part of the ink, Elliot. You're not just a player in the story. You're the ink itself. And as long as you breathe, the ink will keep flowing." Elliot took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing on him. The landscape around him flickered, shifting, growing, and reshaping as if waiting for his response. He could feel the pull of it all, the promise of endless possibilities, the invitation to live a life beyond the ink, beyond the stories he had already created. "So what do I do now?" he asked, his voice barely more than a murmur, his heart racing with the weight of his choice. The figure smiled faintly, a smile that was both knowing and gentle. "You write, you create, and when the ink calls to you again, you answer. But remember, you are never bound by what you have already written. You are free, Elliot. And that freedom," she paused, letting her words hang in the air, "is what makes the ink endless." Her form began to blur once more, fading back into the landscape, as if she were being absorbed by the very ink that surrounded them both. And for a moment, Elliot thought she might disappear completely, but just before she vanished, her voice echoed one last time. "You are the story, and the story is you." With those final words, the ink surged forward, wrapping itself around him like a warm embrace. It was no longer a force he needed to control, nor a world he needed to escape. It was a part of him. He became part of it. And in that moment, as he stood at the edge of an infinite horizon, Elliot knew one thing for sure. There was no end. There was no final chapter. There was only the ever-growing, ever-expanding story. and he was free to write it however he chose. Elliot stood motionless, his feet sinking into the soft, shifting ink beneath him. The horizon stretched out endlessly, an ocean of potential waiting to be charted. There was no path ahead, no clear direction. Yet, for the first time since his journey began, he didn't feel lost. He felt alive, alive in a way he had never truly understood before. The stories, the threads, the infinite possibilities, each one a world unto itself, each one just waiting to be touched, shaped, and brought to life. The weight of creation was no longer a burden. It was a gift. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, feeling the rhythm of the ink pulse around him, resonating in his chest. It was as if the ink had become his heartbeat, the flow of it syncing with his own breath. He wasn't just existing in this world, he was a part of it. His thoughts, his emotions, his choices were woven into the very fabric of reality. "What now?" he whispered, the question lingering in the air. The answer wasn't immediate, but it was there, embedded in the silence. He wasn't looking for a destination anymore. He wasn't searching for an end. What he sought now was meaning, a purpose in the stories he would create, a truth hidden in the ink that only he could uncover. For the first time, he realized that the ink wasn't just a tool. It was a reflection of himself. Every chapter, every page, every line was shaped by him. But it was also shaped by everyone else. By the world, by every soul that had ever existed, and every soul that would ever be. The question no longer hung over him. He wasn't searching for validation, for answers. He wasn't trying to escape. He was free. The ink responded to his thoughts. Lines began to form in the air before him, floating like whispers. They weren't just random words or images. They were the foundation of something new. They were the beginnings of a story. His story. He reached out a hand, watching as the ink pulsed in response. He didn't need to speak, didn't need to command. He simply was, and the world bent around him. It was a freedom that felt both terrifying and exhilarating, but it was a freedom he had earned. A freedom he had fought for. The lines of the ink twisted and turned, weaving together to form a landscape, a place he had never seen but somehow knew. A place of calm, yet full of potential. Trees swayed in a gentle breeze, rivers ran smoothly through lush valleys, and the sky above was a canvas of vibrant colors, stretching into the unknown. "Welcome home," the voice from earlier whispered again, but this time it didn't sound like a command. It was a greeting, a reassurance. "The story is yours now." Elliot took a step forward, feeling the solid ground beneath his feet, the pulse of the world around him. This was his creation, but it wasn't just his. It was something shared, a place for all the stories to converge, for all the choices and moments to come together. As he walked further into the landscape, he noticed something new, figures in the distance, people coming into focus. They weren't just shadows anymore, they were real. He recognized some of them, versions of himself, versions of people he had known, versions of lives he had touched. They walked beside him, their presence a reminder of the interconnectedness of everything. The paths they had all walked, the choices they had made, were all a part of the same story. The stories will always intertwine, a voice echoed behind him. It was familiar, yet distant. It was the voice of Lena, the one who had shown him the way. But it is you, Elliot, who writes the next page. You, and all those who choose to step into this world. He turned to face her, but she was no longer there. Instead, the world around him shimmered, and in the blink of an eye, new possibilities unfolded. The horizon stretched farther than he could see, new landscapes forming, new lives emerging from the ink. He understood now. This was not a place of endings. This was a place of beginnings. Every choice, every life, every moment created ripples in the ink. And those ripples didn't just disappear. They built upon each other, intertwining, weaving a web of stories that would last forever. No matter how many pages were written, no matter how many stories were told, there would always be more to write. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the world. Elliot stood at the edge of a new chapter. "It's only just begun," he whispered to himself. And with that thought, he stepped forward, embracing the ink, embracing the unknown, and stepping into the future, where every possibility awaited and the story would continue. Elliot stood on the precipice of his new world, feeling the weight of possibility pressing down on him like 1,000 threads pulling in every direction. The air around him was thick with potential, as if the very fabric of existence was trembling in anticipation of what was to come. The landscape he had created was vast and beautiful, but something tugged at him, an unsettling sensation that things were not as they seemed. The ink that surrounded him, which had felt so alive and connected only moments before, now seemed to have a shadow within it, a crack in its fluidity. He took a step forward, the soft ground beneath his feet shifting ever so slightly. The sky above, brilliant and endless, began to fracture, as if the horizon itself was splintering into shards of light. Each piece of the broken sky shone with a different hue, a different emotion, each one echoing the inner turmoil that gnawed at his soul. As Elliot watched the fractured sky, a thought began to form in his mind, unbidden but powerful. Was this really the world he wanted to create? The idea hit him like a wave, and he stumbled back, his hands gripping the air as if trying to hold the fragments of the sky together. He had created something beautiful, yes, but what if there were imperfections hidden within the threads, waiting to unravel? What if, in his pursuit of freedom, he had overlooked the deeper consequences of his actions? What if the very act of creation, of becoming the ink itself, was not as freeing as it seemed? A voice broke through his thoughts, but this time, it wasn't the comforting, familiar voice of Lena or the ethereal whispers of the ink. It was something darker, something that seemed to come from the very fractures in the sky. "You can't escape what you've done," the voice murmured, almost as if it were part of the ink itself. "The story isn't yours to control. You can write the words, but you cannot erase the consequences." Elliot's heart skipped a beat as the air around him grew colder, the ink swirling with a strange, unsettling energy. He looked around, but there was no sign of the source of the voice. Just the broken pieces of the sky, shifting and rippling like water disturbed by a storm. "You've made your choices," the voice continued, "and now you must live with them." The words cut through him like shards of glass. He had thought that by becoming the ink, he had freed himself from the limitations of the past, from the weight of the decisions that had once trapped him. But now, in this moment of uncertainty, he wondered if the ink itself was holding him captive, binding him to something far darker than he had anticipated. The ground beneath him trembled, and he stumbled, falling to his knees. The sky above split open wider, the light fractured even more, casting long, jagged shadows across the landscape. The ink, once warm and alive, now felt cold, like the touch of forgotten memory. Elliot closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath, trying to find his center once again. "I can change it," he whispered to himself, the words an attempt at reassurance. "I can make it right. I can write a new story." But even as he said it, a deep, nagging fear gnawed at him. What if the ink couldn't be rewritten? What if there were things in the world, things in him, that were beyond his ability to control? A flicker of movement caught his eye, and he turned just in time to see a figure emerging from the fractured sky. The figure was cloaked in darkness, its features hidden beneath a veil of shadow. It walked toward him slowly, deliberately, as though it were a part of the darkness itself. The figure's presence felt overwhelming, suffocating, as if the very air around him grew heavier with each step. "You can't rewrite everything, Elliot," the figure said, its voice low and steady. "There are things in this world that exist beyond the ink. Things that cannot be erased, no matter how hard you try. Elliot stood, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" he asked, though the question seemed almost pointless. He already knew. The figure stepped closer, and for the first time, its face became visible. It was a reflection of him, of his own face, twisted and warped. The eyes were dark, hollow, empty. "I'm the consequence," the figure said softly. "I'm everything you have avoided. The things you left behind. The stories you never told." Elliot felt his stomach churn. "No," he whispered. "I can fix this. I can." The figure reached out, its hand brushing against the fractured sky, and with a single motion, it began to stitch the broken pieces together, but not in the way Elliot had hoped. Instead, the sky began to merge, but its light dimmed, its colors fading into an eerie monochrome. "There is no going back," the figure intoned. "You cannot escape the consequences of the choices you have made." Elliot stepped back, his heart hammering. He had created this world, yes, but now it seemed like the ink was rejecting him. Like his creation was turning against him, taunting him with the unchangeable truths that lurked beneath the surface. But in the midst of the despair, a flicker of understanding began to form within him. Maybe he couldn't control everything. Maybe the ink wasn't just a canvas to mold it will. It was a living thing, a thing that grew, that changed just as he did. Perhaps it wasn't about erasing the past. Perhaps it was about accepting it. The figure before him flickered, its shape wavering like a ghost in the wind. As it began to dissolve, it left behind a final word, lingering in the air like the last breath of a dying star. "Accept it." Elliot stood in the silence, the words echoing in his mind. The fractured sky began to calm, the ink settling around him. It was still alive, still infinite, still full of potential. But it was no longer just his to control. It was a reflection of everything, of all the choices, all the consequences, and all the lives that had come before. Elliot closed his eyes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to feel everything, the weight of the choices he had made, the things he couldn't change, the things he didn't know. He exhaled slowly, accepting that the story was never just his to tell. And that, in itself, was freedom. Elliot stood there, breathing deeply as the ink around him seemed to settle into something more serene, more stable. The sky, now dim and quiet, was still fractured, but the cracks no longer felt threatening. They felt like reminders that nothing, not even the ink, could ever be perfect. It was a living thing, a force in constant motion, just as he was. He opened his eyes slowly, the darkness no longer overwhelming, but full of quiet possibility. The ink beneath him had turned a soft, pale blue, like the first light of dawn breaking over a distant horizon. He could still feel the hum of the story surrounding him, a constant, gentle pulse that resonated with his heartbeat. And then he saw something, a figure walking toward him from the edge of the horizon. It was tall, outlined against the pale blue light, their silhouette sharp but familiar. The figure moved with purpose, and as it drew closer, Elliot's heart skipped a beat. It was Lena. Her face was soft, peaceful, no longer shrouded in shadow. The lines of her form were clearer now, as though the ink had stopped bending and twisting around her presence. She wasn't a whisper of the past or a distant dream. She was real. And she was here. She stopped before him, her eyes warm with understanding. "You've come a long way, Elliot." He swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. I thought I had broken it. The ink, the world. I thought I couldn't fix it." Lena shook her head gently, her smile kind, patient. "You didn't break it, Elliot. You were never meant to fix it all. No one can." Elliot's brows furrowed in confusion. "But what about the consequences? What about the things I've done, the things I've changed? The ink isn't just a tool anymore. It's alive, and it's with me, but..." He trailed off, unsure of how to finish. Lena's gaze softened. She stepped forward, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "It's with you because you're part of it. You are the ink. But you're also something more. The choices you make, the stories you write, they all matter, Elliot. But they aren't just about you. You're part of something bigger. Elliot closed his eyes, letting the weight of her words settle inside him. For so long, he had been focused on the individual, on himself, on his past, on his need for control and resolution. But now, in the stillness of the ink, he saw the truth. It wasn't just about him. It never had been. The ink is the stories, he murmured, almost as if he were piecing it all together in real time. It's everything. It's the moments we live, the choices we make, and the things we leave behind. It's all intertwined. Lena smiled, her voice soft. Exactly. And that's why you can't rewrite the past. You can't erase what has been, but you can learn from it. You can create with it. Elliot took a deep breath, the weight in his chest easing just slightly. The fear, the uncertainty, the overwhelming sense of responsibility, they were all still there, but now they felt lighter. He understood, at least for now. The ink, this vast, uncharted ocean of stories, wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be embraced. He glanced around, the landscape shifting gently, as though it too had found peace. The horizon stretched out before him, still broken, but not in a way that demanded attention. The cracks in the sky had become like constellations, each a symbol of the stories that had shaped the world, each one telling its own tale, woven into the larger tapestry of life. Elliot's gaze turned back to Lena, his expression steady. I'm not alone in this, am I? Lena shook her head. No, you never were. You're part of everything, Elliot. And everything is part of you. The realization hit him like a wave, not overpowering, but gentle, like a long-lost truth finally remembered. He wasn't a solitary writer, trapped in an endless world of his own creation. He was a thread in a vast, interconnected web of stories, stories that were always in motion, always evolving, always building upon each other. He wasn't in control of it all, but he was a part of it. He had a place in this world. And that place, that understanding, felt like freedom. So what happens now? He asked, his voice calm, but filled with a quiet wonder. Lena's smile deepened, and she stepped back, the world around her shifting again, but this time with ease. Now you live. You write. You create. She paused, her voice lowering as if sharing a secret. But remember, Elliot, there's always more to the story. And sometimes, the most important parts are the ones we don't yet see. Before he could respond, she began to dissolve into the ink, her figure becoming one with the swirling lines of the landscape. The last thing he saw was her eyes, filled with quiet understanding, before she faded completely into the world she had always been a part of. Elliot stood there for a long moment, absorbing the weight of her words. And then, as the ink shifted and reshaped itself around him, he took the first step forward. The world was infinite, the stories endless. And for the first time, Elliot wasn't afraid. He was ready. Elliot walked through the ever-shifting landscape, each step lighter than the last. The ink flowed around him like a river, shaping itself into new forms, new worlds, new lives. There is so much to explore, so much to create. And yet, he understood now that he didn't have to do it all. He wasn't bound by the need to control every aspect of the ink, every thread of the story. The pressure that had once consumed him, the fear of imperfection, of failure, had melted away. He was simply a part of it now, a part of everything. But as he moved deeper into the unknown, a thought lingered in his mind. Something had shifted in him, and though the ink had found its rhythm again, something was still missing. He could feel it in the depths of his being, like a shadow that had yet to be fully acknowledged. He slowed his pace, looking out across the vast, undulating canvas of ink. It was beautiful, yes, but there was a subtle ache within him, a longing for closure, for understanding. What was the true purpose of it all? He had accepted his place in the story, but was there an end to it? Was there a moment when he could truly be at peace with the ink, with the endless flow of creation? The ink swirled around him, responding to his thoughts, but it didn't offer answers. It didn't need to. The answer, it seemed, was already inside him, and that realization struck him with sudden clarity. He had been searching for a purpose in the ink, as though it were something to be fixed or completed. But the ink wasn't a destination. It was a journey, an ongoing, never-ending cycle of creation, destruction, and rebirth. The ink was not a thing to be controlled or conquered. It was a living force, as fluid and ever-changing as the stories it held. It was alive, and that, Elliot realized, was the final truth. The weight that had once burdened him, the need to find an answer, to impose order on the chaos, began to fade. He understood now that there was no final word to be written, no neatly wrapped conclusion. The story would continue, as it always had, shaped by the choices made and the paths walked. Every word, every line, every chapter was just part of a larger, infinite tapestry. And that was enough. Elliot stood before the horizon once more, feeling the presence of the ink surrounding him, now peaceful and steady. He understood that he was no longer bound by the need to control it, no longer haunted by the fear of imperfection. He was part of it, just as it was a part of him. The sky above him, once broken and fragmented, now stretched out as a seamless canvas, a reflection of the balance he had found within himself. The ink, swirling beneath his feet, was no longer an oppressive force, but a gentle current, guiding him forward, supporting him as he moved through this world of infinite possibilities. He smiled a soft, knowing smile. He had walked through darkness, through uncertainty, through fear. And now, as he stood at the edge of this world, he realized that the journey wasn't about reaching a destination. It was about embracing the process, the act of creation, of growth, of being. The ink flowed endlessly, just as the stories would continue. But for the first time, Elliot knew that he had no need to fear the future. He didn't need to control it, or write it all. He simply needed to live it. He was a part of the ink. He always had been. And that was enough. With one final glance at the horizon, Elliot stepped forward, allowing the ink to carry him, not knowing where it would lead, but no longer needing to. The journey was endless, and in that endlessness, there was peace.